You think you know the presidents of the United States, but what if I told you history is hiding some bizarre coincidences they never taught you in school? From eerie deaths on the 4th of July to prophetic dreams and vanishing brains. These stories are real and seriously unsettling. We're diving into 45 of the strangest presidential coincidences ever recorded, and by the end, you'll be questioning how much of history is coincidence and how much is something else entirely. Ready to connect the dots? The Lincoln-Kennedy coincidences, just chance, or something else? Let's start with the most famous, and arguably the creepiest, string of coincidences in presidential history. You've probably heard some of this before. Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy share weird similarities, but once you really stack the facts side by side, it stops feeling like a coincidence and starts feeling like a glitch in the historical matrix. Let's break it down together. Abraham Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. Exactly 100 years later, in 1946, John F. Kennedy was elected to Congress. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy? You guessed it. 1960. Okay, maybe that's just symmetry. Cute. But let's keep going. Both were deeply involved in the struggle for civil rights. Both were shot in the head on a Friday. And both were in the presence of their wives when it happened. Still coincidence? Now get this. Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln, a car made by Ford. Yeah, that's the part where people usually pause. But here's where it gets really spooky. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. There's debate about whether Lincoln's secretary Kennedy is historically verified, but Kennedy's personal secretary was Evelyn Lincoln, and she warned him not to go to Dallas. It gets even more specific. Lincoln was succeeded by Andrew Johnson, who was born in 1808. Kennedy was succeeded by Lyndon B. Johnson, born in 1908. Both Johnsons were Southern Democrats. Both had 13-letter names, and both came into office after an assassinated president. And let's talk about the assassins for a second. Lincoln was killed by John Wilkes Booth. Kennedy was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. Both assassins are known by 3 names. Count the letters, 15 each. Even weirder, Booth was born in 1839, Oswald in 1939. Both were killed before they could be tried in court, and both were killed in front of crowds. Public executions in a way, even if unofficial. Now you might be thinking, okay, sure, some of that is weird, but maybe we're just pattern-seeking creatures, and you'd be absolutely right to be skeptical. But here's the thing. The human brain is hardwired to spot patterns, especially ones that shouldn't exist. When the coincidences start lining up so neatly, dates, names, numbers, even locations, it starts to feel like history is repeating itself on purpose. Could it all be random? Maybe. But if it is, it's the most poetic randomness in U.S. history. And let me ask you this. How many coincidences does it take before it stops being one? That's why this isn't just a fun fact for trivia night. This is about the invisible threads that tie our leaders together, sometimes across centuries. Threads that raise questions no textbook wants to answer. Were Lincoln and Kennedy part of some strange historical echo? Or is this just an unsettling pile of coincidences we're all too eager to connect? Now, if you're thinking that was weird, just wait until you hear what happened to Lincoln's son. Because this next one, it's not a pattern. It's a real-life rescue by the brother of the man who killed his father. You're not going to believe who saved him. And when you find out, you will start to wonder if fate has a twisted sense of humor. The assassin's brother saved Lincoln's son. So here we are. Abraham Lincoln is dead, assassinated in 1865 by John Wilkes Booth. A nation is shattered. A legacy begins. But what if I told you the Booth family story didn't end in that theater? Because not long after that national tragedy, Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, found himself in a dangerous situation. And the person who saved his life was none other than Edwin Booth. Yes, the brother of John Wilkes Booth, the man who murdered his father. Let that sink in for a second. Now, Robert Lincoln wasn't some background character in history. He was the eldest son of the 16th president. Sharp, composed, and deeply involved in American political life for decades after his father's death. But in the early 1860s, before he became Secretary of War or Ambassador to Britain, Robert was just a young man heading to college. One day, while traveling by train in Jersey City, Robert stood on a crowded platform. The train lurched forward, and he lost his footing. In an instant, he slipped into the narrow gap between the platform and the train car, and for a split second, history held its breath. Just then, a strong arm grabbed his collar and yanked him to safety. Robert turned around and immediately recognized his rescuer. Edwin Booth, one of the most famous stage actors in America at the time. The voice, the face, unmistakable. Now here's where it gets surreal. This event happened before the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So, in that moment, Robert was simply grateful. It wasn't until months later, after the president's assassination, that the full weight of the moment hit him and the nation. The brother of the most hated man in America had unknowingly saved the life of the president's son. Robert Lincoln himself confirmed this story years later in a letter to the editor of the Century magazine. He described it in calm, modest detail, but imagine being him. Imagine living with that story locked in your brain forever. Now, we don't know how Edwin Booth felt about it long term, but after his brother's crime, he became reclusive. His acting career was nearly destroyed. Some say the knowledge that he had saved Lincoln's son gave him a kind of redemption, a strange personal atonement for the bloodline he was bound to. And what about Robert? Here's the kicker. This wasn't his only brush with presidential death. Robert Todd Lincoln was present or nearby for 3 presidential assassinations. His father, Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield in 1881, and William McKinley in 1901. After McKinley, he reportedly swore never to attend another presidential event again. Some even joked he was cursed, that if Robert Lincoln showed up, the president better watch his back. But we'll get to that in another segment. For now, just think about the irony. The man who plunged the country into mourning had a brother who pulled the president's son out of a death trap. No one scripted this. No one planned it. And yet it happened. In the chaos of everyday life, right on the edge of a train platform. What are the odds? We're 2 segments in, and already fate seems to be playing with loaded dice. But buckle up, because coming up next, we're diving into a series of presidential deaths that all happened on the same day. Not just any day. July 4th. Coincidence? Maybe, but 3 presidents dying on Independence Day? That deserves a closer look. The presidents who died on the 4th of July. Alright, so picture this. It's July 4th. Fireworks are popping. Flags are waving. You're celebrating American independence. But if you were living in the early 1800s, you might have noticed a strange and slightly disturbing pattern forming. Because 3 U.S. presidents, all founding fathers, died on Independence Day. Let's start with the most poetic of them all. On July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, 2 of the document's key architects, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, both died on the same day, just hours apart. Now, Jefferson had been the primary author of the Declaration. Adams was his sometimes friend, sometimes rival, and a fierce defender of independence. They had fought, reconciled, and spent their final years writing long, thoughtful letters to each other. It was like watching 2 old lions who had once ruled the same pride now, exchanging memories instead of roars. But here's where it gets really strange. John Adams's final words reportedly were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He didn't know Jefferson had died earlier that same day, just hours before. That's right, 2 of America's most influential presidents, former friends, former enemies, co-founders of the nation, died within hours of each other on the 50th birthday of the country they helped create. Coincidence? Or was something else at work? Now, if it were just those 2, we might chalk it up to poetic timing. But 5 years later, it happened again. James Monroe, the 5th president, also died on July 4th in 1831. That's 3 presidents, 3 of the earliest leaders of the Republic, all dying on July 4th. To be clear, no other date in American history comes close to matching that level of presidential death, not even tragic ones like November 22nd or April 14th. So what's going on? Is it pure chance? Maybe. But think about how rare this actually is. The US has had 46 presidents. Only 8 have died outside of office, and of those, 3 died on the same date, a date loaded with national symbolism, patriotism, and historical weight. Some historians think the emotional strain of the approaching anniversary, especially for aging founding fathers, may have influenced their bodies more than we understand. Others think it's just a neat freak occurrence with no deeper meaning. But deep down, doesn't part of you wonder, if the universe was ever going to send us a message, this might be the way to do it. 3 presidents dying on the one day America was born, not on Christmas, not on New Year's, not on the day they were elected, but the symbolic day of the Republic. That's not just eerie, that's theatrical. And speaking of presidents with a flair for the dramatic, the next one wasn't born on July 4th. He was sworn in by his own father in a dark Vermont cabin by lamplight. Oh, and it happened because the sitting president had suddenly died under strange circumstances. We're heading into a quiet, icy night in 1923 and into one of the most low-key, high-stakes transitions of power in U.S. history. Don't go anywhere, because next up, a president takes the oath in his pajamas and maybe breaks a curse in the process. The president sworn in by lamplight and the curse he might have broken. Let's set the scene. It's the dead of night, August 3rd, 1923. You're deep in the hills of Plymouth Notch, Vermont. No cell phones, no press conferences, just one oil lamp glowing in a farmhouse. Inside, a man is roused from sleep. He's in bedclothes, half awake. He's just been told that President Warren G. Harding's dead. And now, suddenly, he is the President of the United States. That man, Calvin Coolidge. And here's where it gets weird. Because standing in front of him with a Bible is his own father. That's right. Coolidge was sworn in as president by his dad, John Calvin Coolidge Sr., a notary public and justice of the peace by lamplight in the middle of the night in their family living room. Imagine that. One moment you're a quiet vice president visiting your parents. The next, your father is administering the oath of office for the most powerful job in the world, wearing slippers. It's one of the strangest and most intimate presidential transitions in U.S. history. But here's what most people don't know. Calvin Coolidge may have also broken a 120-year curse that had haunted the White House since the days of Tecumseh. Let's rewind. Back in 1840, William Henry Harrison was elected president and died just a month into office. That started what became known as Tecumseh's Curse, or the Curse of Tippecanoe. According to the legend, Native American leader Tecumseh, after losing the Battle of Tippecanoe, cursed the presidency. And from 1840 onward, every president elected in a year ending in 0 died in office. Harrison 1840, Lincoln 1860, Garfield 1880, McKinley 1900, Roosevelt 1940, and Kennedy 1960. Even Harding, elected in 1920, died suddenly of a heart attack while traveling in San Francisco. So when Coolidge took that oath in the flickering lamplight, he was stepping into a presidency wrapped in fear, superstition, and a whole lot of bad luck. Here's the twist. Coolidge survived. He finished Harding's term. He ran again in 1924 and won. And he left office alive and well in 1929. Some say the curse was broken. Others say it just paused. But the mystery deepened again in 1980 when Ronald Reagan, also elected in a 0 year, was shot just months into his term and survived by inches. You can draw your own conclusions. Maybe Coolidge's quiet, almost mystical swearing in reset the cycle. Or maybe fate decided to ease off the throttle after decades of destruction. But there's something eerie about that image. A man becoming president by his father's hand, surrounded by darkness, taking on not just the job, but the weight of history's strangest pattern. And you have to wonder, if Harding hadn't died suddenly, would Coolidge ever have become more than a footnote? Yet here he is, possibly one of the most accidentally important presidents in breaking a deadly streak. One more thing before we move on. Coolidge wasn't just a placeholder. He left behind policies, scandals, and a personality that shaped the 1920s in ways most people forget. But for now, it's that midnight oath and the timing of it that leaves us blinking in disbelief. And speaking of timing, what if I told you Lincoln's own death wasn't a total surprise because he actually dreamed about it days before it happened? Stick around, because the next coincidence comes straight from the edge of the supernatural. Lincoln's death dream, the president who saw his own funeral. Some coincidences feel like math. Others feel like fate. And then there's this one, the story of a president who saw his own death in vivid detail days before it happened. This isn't folklore. It's not poetic license. Abraham Lincoln himself told people about the dream before he was assassinated. His close friend and bodyguard, Ward Hill Lamon, later recorded the whole thing in writing. Let's rewind to the final days of Lincoln's life. The Civil War was nearly over. The country was exhausted. Lincoln was finally seeing the end of the bloodshed and just beginning to think about peace and reconstruction. But behind that calm exterior, he carried a growing sense of unease. And then came the dream. Lincoln described it like this. He found himself walking through the White House alone, late at night. The halls were silent. He heard weeping, sobbing, but no one was in sight. As he followed the sound, he entered the East Room, and what he saw stopped him cold. There in the room was a coffin, draped in black, surrounded by soldiers standing guard. Lincoln asked one of them, "Who is dead in the White House?" The soldier replied, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln woke up shaken. He told his wife, Mary. He told his friends. And according to laymen, they begged him not to go out in public. But Lincoln was Lincoln, stoic, unflinching. He wasn't about to let fear dictate his life. So on April 14th, 1865, just days after sharing his dream, Abraham Lincoln went to Ford's Theater, and he never came home. The dream became reality. The East Room did hold his coffin, draped in black, the weeping, the guards, the assassin, exactly as he had seen it. Now, there are skeptics. Some say maybe laymen exaggerated the dream after Lincoln's death to build the myth, but Mary Lincoln confirmed it too, and so did others close to the president. This wasn't a passing mention. It shook him. Here's where the rabbit hole deepens. This wasn't Lincoln's only brush with dark visions. Throughout his presidency, he reportedly spoke of feeling death nearby. He once saw a double image of himself in a mirror, one version pale and ghostly, and believed it was a sign he wouldn't survive his second term. His wife thought so too. That's the thing about Lincoln. He wasn't just a leader. He was strangely in tune with death, as if he could hear it knocking before anyone else noticed. Now, was it intuition? Was it stress-fueled hallucination? Was it coincidence? Or was it something we don't have a word for? Either way, it happened. A president described his own assassination before it happened, and then lived it almost frame by frame. So, what do we do with that? Maybe we don't explain it. Maybe we just let it sit there. Another uncomfortable piece of the presidential puzzle. And maybe, just maybe, it's a reminder that even the most powerful people in history sometimes feel the tremors of fate before it strikes. And speaking of fate, how do you explain a man being near not one, not two, but 3 presidential assassinations? Because Lincoln's son Robert didn't just survive history, he kept showing up in it again and again, and it got so weird, people thought he was cursed. We'll unpack that bizarre timeline and what it did to his life in the next segment. Let me know when you're ready to roll into segment 6. Excellent. Let's keep this going strong. Here's segment 6, diving into the eerie case of a man who kept showing up where presidents died. The man who was at 3 presidential assassinations. Okay, we've talked about Lincoln's haunting dream before his death, but what if I told you that his son might have lived through an even stranger string of coincidences? Meet Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's eldest son. Now, Robert wasn't a president or a general or even a particularly famous politician, but for some reason, he kept showing up right before or during presidential assassinations. And after a while, people started asking, was this man cursed? Let's walk through it. First, of course, he was at Ford's Theater when his father was shot, April 14, 1865. He wasn't sitting next to his parents, but he was in D.C. at the time and arrived at the deathbed scene shortly after the shooting. That alone is a traumatic enough brush with history for a lifetime. But history wasn't done with Robert yet. Fast forward 16 years. July 2nd, 1881. President James A. Garfield is walking through a Washington, D.C. train station when he's shot by Charles Guiteau, a deranged man obsessed with politics and rejection. And guess who's there? Robert Todd Lincoln, serving as Garfield's Secretary of War. Not only is he nearby, he's in the train station when the shots are fired. He rushes to the scene. Garfield lives for a few more weeks, but eventually dies of infection. That's assassination number 2. Now, at this point, you think maybe Robert would take a step back from presidential proximity, but history had other plans. 20 years later, in 1901, President William McKinley is attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. A man named Leon Czolgosz walks up to him at a public reception and shoots him point blank. And yes, Robert Todd Lincoln is there. Again, he had been invited as a guest of honor. He didn't witness the shooting directly, but he was on the grounds and among the first to be notified. 3 presidents, 3 assassinations, and Robert Todd Lincoln hovering on the edges of all of them. After that, he stopped going to presidential events for real. In later years, when invited to the White House or official ceremonies, Robert reportedly refused, joking grimly, "There is a certain fatality about presidential functions when I am present." Now, pause and think about that for a second. What are the odds? Sure, he was politically active. He had government roles, but so did hundreds of others. And yet he, and only he, was linked to 3 of the 4 presidential assassinations in U.S. history. Some historians say it's pure chance. Others call it the Lincoln curse. Some even believe he carried a strange karmic burden from his father's tragic legacy, as if fate kept drawing him back to repeat the cycle. Whatever you believe, it happened. 3 separate presidents, 3 violent ends, 1 man who just kept showing up. And here's the haunting part. Robert Todd Lincoln lived until 1926. He never wrote much about the assassinations, never speculated. He just lived and carried the strange shadow that followed him for over 60 years. But strange shadows seem to love the presidency, because in our next story, we're diving into a man who didn't become president until after he died. Yes, you heard that right. Our next segment is about the dead man elected president. You're not going to want to miss this one. The man who was president for one day, while the real one was dead. You've heard of presidents who were assassinated, presidents who died in office, even presidents who weren't elected at all. But what if I told you there was once a man who may have been president of the United States for just one day, and he never even took the oath? Let's talk about David Rice Atchison, senator from Missouri and possibly the most accidental president in American history. It all happened in 1849 during a simple quirk of scheduling. Here's what went down. President James K. Polk had served his full term and was set to step down on March 4th, 1849, a Sunday. Back then, presidential inaugurations always happened on March 4th. But here's the twist. Zachary Taylor, the president-elect, refused to take the oath of office on a Sunday for religious reasons. So Polk's term ended at noon on Sunday, March 4th. Taylor wouldn't take the oath until Monday, March 5th. For that 24-hour gap, the United States technically had no sworn-in president or vice president, and that's where Senator David Rice Atchison enters the picture. At the time, he was president pro tempore of the Senate, which placed him next in line of succession after the vice president. But since Vice President George Dallas's term had ended with Polk's, and the new VP hadn't been sworn in either, that made Atchison the next man up. So, legally speaking, was David Rice Atchison president for a day? That depends who you ask. There's no definitive record of him issuing any orders, signing any documents, or even acknowledging the job. In fact, he reportedly spent most of that Sunday napping after a late-night Senate session. Years later, when asked about it, Atchison joked, "I slept most of the day and missed all the fun." Still, the situation stirred debate among historians and constitutional nerds. After all, the presidency is a legal chain of custody, and for 24 hours the chain was broken. What's even stranger, Atchison's name is carved into his tombstone with the title, President of the United States for one day. Now, before you go rewriting your presidential trivia books, let's be clear, most scholars don't officially count Atchison. He's not on the White House website. He never took the oath, and no one saluted him or handed him the nuclear codes. Not that they existed, but in terms of raw technicality, he may have had more claim to the job that day than anyone else alive. And that makes this story something of a Schrodinger's presidency. He was and wasn't the president at the same time. A man asleep on a couch in Washington may have held the most powerful office in the world, simply because the real president wouldn't take the oath until Monday. That's history for you. It's not always made by the loudest men in the room. Sometimes it's made by the ones no one notices. And speaking of being unnoticed, the next coincidence takes us deep into the shadows of power, where one president signed a law creating the Secret Service just hours before he was assassinated. He had no idea he'd need their protection. But as you'll see, neither did America. Lincoln created the Secret Service the day he was shot. Some stories feel like they were written for TV, complete with dramatic irony, tragic timing, and a punchline that hits a little too hard. This is one of those stories. On April 14th, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln went about his day as usual. It was a Friday. He had meetings, he saw visitors, he was making plans for post-war reconstruction, and even discussed attending a play that night, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater. What no one realized, not even Lincoln, was that this would be his last day alive. But earlier that same day, just hours before stepping into his carriage, Lincoln signed a piece of legislation. It was unremarkable at the time, a quiet administrative act. That law? It officially created the United States Secret Service. Let that sink in. The president, who would be assassinated that very night, had authorized the creation of the agency meant to protect presidents mere hours before his own murder. Now, before you picture black-suited agents jumping in front of bullets, you should know. The original purpose of the Secret Service had nothing to do with presidential protection. It was actually founded to combat counterfeiting, which was a huge problem after the Civil War. At the time, more than 1/3 of all currency in circulation was fake. The government needed a specialized task force to track down and eliminate counterfeit operations. So the Secret Service was born, ironically, on the same day Lincoln died, and completely unaware of the role it would someday play. It wasn't until 1901, after the assassination of William McKinley, that the Secret Service was officially assigned to protect the president, which means that Lincoln created the agency that could have saved his life, but not soon enough to save himself. Think about the layers here. The country is celebrating the end of the Civil War. Lincoln is talking about healing, rebuilding, and reconciliation. He's planning the next chapter of the nation, and in the background, without fanfare, he signs a law to build a new institution, one that, unbeknownst to him, will become essential for every future president's survival. Then, that night, he walks into a theater and never walks out. That's not just a coincidence. That's the kind of moment that history seems to script. It raises the question, did Lincoln sense danger? He had those premonitions, those nightmares, those mirror visions. He knew assassination was possible, even expected it. So, why didn't he push for protection sooner? Maybe he thought he'd be fine. Maybe he was just tired of war and conflict, or maybe he didn't believe anyone could stop what was coming. Either way, the fact remains. Abraham Lincoln created the Secret Service the same day he was assassinated. That's not folklore. That's fact. And it gives this entire story a kind of tragic symmetry. Like he was trying to protect the future just as his own fate was being sealed. But history has a twisted sense of humor. Because while Lincoln's assassination marked the beginning of Secret Service relevance, another president, nearly a century later, would break a deadly curse by surviving the very thing that doomed all his predecessors. Coming up next, a gunman, a miracle, and a cowboy president who should have died, but didn't. Ronald Reagan's survival in 1981 wasn't just lucky. It might have changed the course of presidential history. Reagan was shot and might have broken a 140-year curse. Some presidents survive scandal, others survive war, but Ronald Reagan, he survived something far stranger, and in doing so may have ended a deadly curse that had haunted the presidency for over a century. It was called Tecumseh's Curse, or sometimes the Curse of Tippecanoe. Here's the legend. In the early 1800s, Native American leader Tecumseh was fighting to resist American expansion. His forces were defeated by William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Tippecanoe. As the story goes, a curse was placed on Harrison, and every president elected in a year ending in 0. Now, whether that curse is real or just a folk tale, what followed is chilling. Let's look at the pattern. 1840, William Henry Harrison, elected, died of pneumonia a month into his term. 1860, Abraham Lincoln, elected, assassinated in 1865. 1880, James Garfield, elected, shot and died the next year. 1900, William McKinley, re-elected, assassinated in 1901. 1920, Warren G. Harding, died of a heart attack in 1923. 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected to a third term, died in 1945. 1960, John F. Kennedy, elected, assassinated in 1963. 7 presidents, 7 deaths, all elected in years ending in 0. Enter Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980. And sure enough, less than 3 months into his presidency, on March 30th, 1981, Reagan was shot in the chest by a mentally unstable man named John Hinckley Jr. A single bullet pierced Reagan's lung and came within an inch of his heart. At 70 years old, the oldest president at the time, few expected him to survive. But Reagan didn't just survive. He bounced back fast. He walked into the hospital on his own, cracked jokes with the nurses, "I hope you're all Republicans," and made a full recovery. It wasn't just a win for Reagan. It was the first time a president elected in a 0 year had survived an assassination attempt since the 1840s. Some people, even in the White House, started whispering, "Did Reagan break the curse?" Here's where it gets weirder. Reagan's wife, Nancy, was famously superstitious. She consulted astrologers regularly, especially after the shooting, to help plan her husband's schedule. She was terrified the curse might strike again. So she used everything from horoscopes to rituals to try and outsmart fate. The Reagans never publicly admitted to believing in the curse, but the signs were there. Changes to travel dates, meeting times, even press appearances were allegedly influenced by Nancy's psychic advisors. And you know what? It worked. Reagan not only survived the shooting, he went on to serve 2 full terms and became a towering political figure of the 1980s. The curse? It stopped with him. Even George W. Bush, elected in 2000, faced a few brushes with death, including a grenade thrown at him during a rally in Georgia, but emerged unscathed. So, did Reagan truly break Tecumseh's curse, or did history just decide to call it off? Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was medical advancement, or maybe it was something older, something ancient, finally released. Whatever the truth is, Reagan walked away from a pattern that had killed 7 of his predecessors, and by doing so, he left behind one of the greatest presidential what-ifs in modern memory. But Reagan isn't the only president tied to mysterious fate, because in our next segment, we're going to meet a man who never wanted to be president and still managed to get arrested while in office for something hilariously unexpected. You're not going to believe what William Howard Taft got caught doing and where he got stuck. The president who got arrested and stuck in a bathtub. Presidents deal with wars, scandals, and assassinations, but sometimes they just deal with being too large for the furniture. Enter William Howard Taft, the 27th president of the United States, and without a doubt, the heaviest. Let's start with the basics. Taft weighed somewhere between 300 and 340 pounds during his presidency. He was a big guy with a big appetite, and he didn't shy away from it. But one story has stuck with him, literally, for over a century. The bathtub incident. You've probably heard the legend. President Taft got stuck in the White House bathtub, and it took 4 men to pull him out. It's become one of the most famous, weirdly enduring pieces of presidential trivia ever. But is it true? Well, kind of. There's no official record from the White House about the incident, but multiple credible sources, including Taft's own staff, confirmed that after one particularly awkward situation, a custom extra-large bathtub was ordered for the White House. The replacement tub, it was 7 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, and could reportedly hold 4 adult men comfortably. And yes, Taft did bathe in it. Photos of the massive tub being installed exist to this day. So, while the exact details of the getting stuck story may be exaggerated, the White House clearly responded with, let's say, a structural solution. But wait, that's not even the strangest part of Taft's time in office, because he's also the only US president who's ever been arrested while in office. No, not for a crime, not for corruption, for speeding. Here's the story. Back in the early 1900s, Washington, D.C. had strict speed limits for carriages and early automobiles, around 12 miles per hour. Taft, an enthusiastic driver, or rather enthusiastic about being driven, loved speeding around in his fancy motor car. One day, his driver got a little too eager with the gas pedal and was pulled over by a traffic officer. Now the officer didn't realize at first who was inside the car. When he did, he still wrote the ticket. Taft, instead of pulling rank, reportedly laughed it off and paid the fine. Imagine that today. A sitting president calmly getting ticketed and saying, "Yeah, fair enough." Taft had a surprising humility about his size and public image. He once joked that he'd make a better Chief Justice than a president, and guess what? He was right. After his presidency, Taft became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only person in history to lead both branches. But to most people, he'll always be remembered as the president who couldn't quite fit into the average American bathtub. Now, is that fair? Probably not. But history doesn't always preserve what's most important. Sometimes it preserves what's most memorable. So we've covered bathtub rescues, speeding tickets, and curse-breaking recoveries. But let's take it back to something eerier. In the next segment, we're heading into a funeral. A presidential funeral seen in a dream by the man who was about to die. That's right. Not Lincoln this time. Another president with a haunting vision that came true. And this time the death was far more sudden. The president who died after eating cherries and milk. Sometimes death comes with a warning. Other times it shows up in the most innocent disguise, like a bowl of fruit on a summer afternoon. Let's talk about Zachary Taylor, the 12th president of the United States, a war hero, a political outsider, and a man whose sudden death in office left the nation confused, suspicious, and hungry for answers. Here's what we know. On July 4th, 1850, President Taylor was attending a massive Independence Day celebration in Washington, D.C. The weather was brutal, hot, humid, suffocating. After standing in the sun for hours listening to speeches, Taylor returned to the White House famished and overheated. So he did what any of us might do on a boiling afternoon. He snacked. According to multiple accounts, Taylor consumed a large quantity of cold milk and fresh cherries, maybe even a couple of cucumbers and iced water. Sounds refreshing, right? Except within hours, he was violently ill. Taylor developed severe cramping, vomiting, and diarrhea. His condition rapidly worsened over the next few days. Doctors at the time blamed it on cholera morbus, a vague 19th century term for stomach illness caused by contaminated food or water. And on July 9th, 1850, just 5 days after that fateful picnic, Zachary Taylor was dead. He'd only served 16 months in office. At first, people accepted the official story, food poisoning or gastrointestinal disease. But decades later, historians and conspiracy theorists started asking tougher questions. Why did Taylor die so suddenly and so violently? Why wasn't he treated more aggressively? And here's the kicker. Could he have been poisoned? Remember, Taylor was an outsider president, elected largely for his military fame, and he had made powerful enemies in both the North and South by opposing the expansion of slavery into new territories. Some speculated that pro-slavery extremists might have wanted him gone, especially since his death cleared the path for Millard Fillmore, who supported the Compromise of 1850, which helped preserve slavery in southern states. So in 1991, yes, over 140 years later, Taylor's body was actually exhumed. Scientists ran modern toxicology tests on samples of his hair and nails, searching for signs of arsenic or other poisons. The result? Inconclusive. There was no evidence of fatal arsenic levels, but that doesn't mean it wasn't poison. Many toxins common in the 1800s would have degraded over time or left no clear trace at all. Which brings us right back to the cherries. To this day, Taylor's death is officially chalked up to some kind of gastrointestinal infection, likely caused by unwashed fruit, spoiled milk, or contaminated water. But something about the story still doesn't sit right. Maybe it's the symbolism. A president who dies on the 4th of July weekend, brought down not by bullets or war, but by a summer snack. Or maybe it's the timing. Dying just as he was starting to challenge the nation's most divisive issue, slavery. Coincidence? Bad luck? Or something darker, hidden under layers of time? Either way, it's one of the strangest and most suspicious deaths in presidential history. And speaking of suspicious timing, in our next segment, we'll look at the story of a president whose own brain went missing after his assassination and still hasn't been found. Yes, literally missing. You're going to want to hear what happened to John F. Kennedy's brain. The case of JFK's missing brain. Of all the strange coincidences in presidential history, few are as quietly unsettling as this one. You know the basics. John F. Kennedy, the 35th president, was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. The nation watched in horror as grainy footage and panicked reports confirmed what no one wanted to believe. But what many people don't know is that in the chaos that followed, a critical piece of the investigation Literally part of Kennedy's body simply vanished. His brain. Yes. John F. Kennedy's brain was removed during the autopsy at Bethesda Naval Hospital. This was standard procedure for high-profile forensic cases. The brain was placed in a stainless steel container, cataloged, and stored as evidence. It was intended for further study, particularly to determine the exact trajectory of the bullets that hit him, and then it disappeared. Sometime in 1966, 3 years after the assassination, government officials realized that the brain, along with over a dozen other pieces of medical evidence, was missing from the National Archives. Gone. No trace. No explanation. Now let that land for a moment. The brain of a U.S. president, assassinated under still debated circumstances, was in government custody and then simply vanished. The official story? A misfile or accidental destruction. Sure. And if that feels like a shrug from history, you're not alone. Researchers, journalists, and conspiracy theorists have all asked the obvious question: how do you misplace a president's brain? One popular theory is that Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother, may have ordered the brain quietly removed and destroyed, possibly to prevent further public dissection of his brother's legacy or to hide evidence that contradicted the official autopsy report. Another theory, more conspiratorial, suggests that the brain contained forensic evidence pointing to a second shooter or an alternative trajectory of the fatal bullet. Remember, the Warren Commission concluded that a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, fired from behind Kennedy. But multiple witnesses claimed shots came from different directions. Some believed the wounds weren't consistent with a single bullet from the rear, and without the brain to examine, the case will forever have a missing puzzle piece. Here's where it gets even stranger. The brain wasn't the only thing that disappeared. Other tissues, photographs, and x-rays from the autopsy also vanished or were sealed under strict secrecy. It's hard not to feel like something's being covered up. Even official biographers admit that the disappearance is, at best, suspicious, and at worst, a deliberate erasure of key evidence. So what does that leave us with? A president shot in broad daylight, a nation thrown into mourning, an investigation that leaves more questions than answers, and a brain that simply walked out of the vault? It's not just a mystery. That's a historical black hole. And here's the real kicker. Even now, 6 decades later, no one has been held accountable. No one knows who had the final chain of custody. No official report has ever explained the full story, and the Kennedy family has remained mostly silent. So, we're left with the question, what happened to JFK's brain? And maybe more importantly, what were we not supposed to see? Coming up next, a presidential family with a long, eerie legacy of death, where the men seemed marked by destiny and bad luck. Yes, we're talking about the Kennedys again, because JFK wasn't the only one to die tragically. Not even close. The Kennedy curse. Coincidence or inescapable fate? At some point, it stops feeling like bad luck. The Kennedy family has been called America's royalty. Young, powerful, glamorous, influential. But beneath the shining surface lies one of the most tragic streaks of misfortune in American political history. It's so extensive, so relentless, that people started calling it what it feels like, the Kennedy curse. Let's start with the obvious. John F. Kennedy, assassinated at 46 while riding in a convertible next to his wife in broad daylight. We've already talked about the missing brain, the disputed bullets, the suspicious aftermath. That would be enough tragedy for most families. But for the Kennedys, that was just one chapter. Go back a little earlier to Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., JFK's older brother. He was the family's first political hope, a decorated pilot in World War II. In 1944, he volunteered for a secret bombing mission over in Nazi Germany. The plane exploded mid-air. His body was never recovered. Then there was Kathleen Kick Kennedy, JFK's sister. She married into British nobility and was widowed within a month. Later in 1948, she died in a plane crash while flying with her new partner, the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam. JFK himself barely survived multiple near-death experiences before Dallas, including World War II shipwrecks and chronic health conditions. He was, quite literally, stitched together by fate long before Oswald ever took aim. And then came Robert F. Kennedy, the younger brother, attorney general, and rising political star. Just 5 years after JFK's assassination, Robert was shot and killed while running for president in 1968. Again, in front of a crowd. Again, with America watching. But the pattern didn't stop with the brothers. JFK Jr., John's only son, nicknamed America's Prince, died in 1999 when his small plane crashed into the Atlantic Ocean on the way to Martha's Vineyard. He was 38. His wife and sister-in-law died with him. And these aren't just a few freak events. The list of Kennedy family tragedies is long and bizarrely specific. Ted Kennedy survived a plane crash in 1964, but broke his back. Chappaquiddick, 1969. Ted drove off a bridge, escaped the car, but left behind passenger Mary Jo Kopechne, who drowned. David Kennedy, RFK's son, died of a drug overdose at 28. Michael Kennedy, another son, died in a skiing accident in 1997. Cyrus Kennedy Hill, RFK's granddaughter, died of an overdose in 2019. Plane crashes, car accidents, assassinations, overdoses, one after another, decades apart, but eerily similar in their suddenness and public spectacle. So what is it? A curse? A coincidence? The statistical risk of being a high-profile, high-pressure American dynasty? Maybe it's all three. But even for skeptics, the sheer number of tragedies clustered in one family defies expectations. It's not just that Kennedys have died. It's the how, the when, and the public nature of their deaths that makes the pattern feel unnatural. Some say the family was cursed by ambition. Others say it's the price of fame. But deep down, there's a quiet sense that the Kennedys were marked and that tragedy walked beside them generation after generation. And if you think that's just poetic talk, wait until you hear about the president whose death dream came true, but wasn't Lincoln or Kennedy or any president you'd expect. In the next segment, we're going back to a leader who saw the end coming and may have even predicted the exact time. The president who predicted his own death, down to the hour. It's one thing to worry about dying. It's another to see it coming, not just in theory, but in terrifying detail. We've already covered Lincoln's prophetic dream, but he wasn't the only president who seemed to get a warning from beyond. This time, the spotlight falls on James A. Garfield, the 20th president of the United States. His time in office was short, very short. Just 4 months in, he was shot by a disgruntled office seeker named Charles Guiteau on July 2nd, 1881, at a train station in Washington, D.C. Garfield didn't die immediately. He lingered for 80 painful days, slowly wasting away from infections, medical mismanagement, and the limits of 19th century science. Eventually, on September 19th, 1881, he succumbed to sepsis and internal bleeding. But here's the strange part. Garfield had predicted his own death, including the exact hour. Let's back up. According to multiple reports from his friends and family, Garfield had an uneasy feeling about becoming president. He didn't even campaign for the job. He was chosen at the Republican convention almost accidentally as a compromise candidate after a deadlock. He once told a friend, "I am being pushed toward the presidency against my will." Even more unsettling, a few weeks before the shooting, Garfield allegedly said he didn't expect to serve long, that his time in the White House would be brief and shadowed by danger. That's dramatic, sure. But here's where the story gets specific. The night before his death, Garfield, drifting in and out of fevered consciousness, reportedly looked at the clock and said to those around him, "This is the end of it. I have been expecting it." He told his doctor the precise hour he believed he would die. And then he did. On the morning of September 19, Garfield passed away, almost exactly when he said he would. Now, skeptics might say that any dying man can predict his death when he's that close to the end, that it's not prophecy, it's biology, and fair enough. But there's something about Garfield's premonitions before he was ever shot, his doubts, his dreams, his dread, that make this more than just a case of "I told you so." Some believe he was deeply intuitive. Others think he may have had recurring visions or dreams, like Lincoln, that hinted at his fate. One account says he told a colleague that being president felt like being led to execution. He wasn't wrong. And the weirdness doesn't stop there. Remember that Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, was present when Garfield was shot, just like he had been when his father was assassinated, just like he would be again 20 years later when President McKinley was killed. So Garfield wasn't just a man with a dark intuition about his own fate. He was also another chapter in a strange loop of death that seemed to follow the presidency like a shadow. It begs the question, how many of our leaders have felt the pressure of something bigger, something inevitable? And if they really know what's coming, what does that say about the job? Up next, another strange warning. Not to a president this time, but to the public. Because in the next segment, we'll look at a president who may have been tipped off by a psychic and whose wife helped run the White House based on astrological charts. Yes, we're going into the mystic side of the Oval Office. The First Lady, the stars, and the secret astrology of the White House. You wouldn't expect horoscopes and high office to go hand in hand. But in the Reagan White House, the stars had more influence than the public ever knew. Let's start with the moment that changed everything. On March 30th, 1981, just 2 months into his presidency, Ronald Reagan was shot in Washington, D.C. by John Hinckley Jr. The bullet missed his heart by less than an inch. He survived, barely, and the country held its breath. But behind the scenes, the event didn't just rattle Reagan. It terrified Nancy. According to former White House Chief of Staff Donald Reagan, after the assassination attempt, Nancy Reagan began secretly consulting an astrologer to help guide her husband's schedule and his safety. The astrologer's name? Joan Quigley, a well-known figure in San Francisco's psychic and astrology circles. Here's where it gets weird. Nancy didn't just ask for general advice like, is tomorrow a good day for a speech? She gave Quigley access to Reagan's entire calendar, travel dates, press briefings, even takeoff times for Air Force One. If Quigley said the stars were misaligned, events were rescheduled. Seriously. According to Reagan's memoir, For the Record, Quigley essentially became an unofficial advisor, with Nancy acting as the go-between. Important meetings and public appearances were moved to avoid dangerous astrological alignments. One White House staffer even said, virtually every major move and decision the Reagans made during my time in the White House was cleared in advance with a woman in San Francisco who drew up horoscopes. Now the Reagans kept all of this deeply private. If word had gotten out at the time, it could have sparked a national scandal, or at least a good late-night comedy monologue. A world leader influenced by the Zodiac? Not a great headline, but it's worth remembering that this wasn't about superstition for Nancy. It was about control, about doing anything to protect her husband after nearly losing him. After all, Reagan had just survived an assassination attempt, and she was determined not to tempt fate again. And here's the strangest part of all. It worked. Reagan went on to serve 2 full terms, with no further assassination attempts, no serious health crises until after office, and some of the highest approval ratings in modern history. So, whether you believe in astrology or not, the record speaks for itself. But let's not stop there. Nancy wasn't the only First Lady with mystical leanings. Mary Todd Lincoln famously held seances in the White House. Hillary Clinton was rumored to have spoken with the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt, with help from spiritual advisor Jean Houston. Even Franklin Pierce's wife believed ghosts haunted the executive mansion. So, maybe the White House isn't just a seat of power. Maybe it's a place where people stressed, scared, uncertain, start reaching for anything to help them make sense of the chaos. And if that means peeking at the stars now and then, well, history has seen stranger things. But what if the stars don't just guide decisions? What if they guide tragedy? Because in the next segment, we're looking at a chilling case of 2 presidents dying on the exact same date, decades apart, both with eerie ties to each other. Yes, Andrew Johnson and Zachary Taylor shared more than a strange career path. They may have shared a fatal pattern. 2 presidents, 1 date, and a shared shadow. If you've been following along, you've probably noticed something by now. Presidential history isn't just shaped by politics. It's shaped by timing, sometimes down to the day. And in this case, 2 very different presidents, separated by decades, died on the exact same date, July 9th. That's not a typo. That's twice in U.S. history that the commander-in-chief has died on that specific day. And the coincidences don't stop there. Let's start with the first. Zachary Taylor, the 12th president of the United States. We already talked about his strange death in segment 11, how he likely died of gastroenteritis after consuming cherries and milk at a 4th of July event in 1850. Just 5 days later, on July 9th, he was dead. The official cause was intestinal distress. The unofficial theories? poison, heat stroke, or maybe just bad luck. Whatever the truth, his presidency ended just 16 months after it began. Now let's fast forward 25 years to 1875. Andrew Johnson, the 17th president and Abraham Lincoln's successor, dies on July 9th. He wasn't assassinated. He wasn't in office. He died of a stroke while visiting his daughter in Tennessee. But the timing is where things get strange. Not only did he die on the same day as Taylor, but Johnson's presidency was also defined by a very similar kind of tension: national division, regional chaos, and widespread unpopularity. Taylor, remember, was caught in the crossfire between pro- and anti-slavery factions. Johnson, meanwhile, led the nation through the mess after the Civil War and made enemies on both sides of Reconstruction. In fact, Johnson is often remembered as one of the most embattled presidents in history. He was impeached, the first president ever to be, barely escaped removal from office, and died largely forgotten by the public. So here we are. Zachary Taylor, a compromise candidate who tried to hold the Union together, dies on July 9th, 1850. Andrew Johnson, the accidental president who failed to hold that same Union together after war, dies on July 9th, 1775. Two very different men, two troubled presidencies, one shared date. Now, skeptics might say, so what? Every date has historical overlap. Fair enough. But remember, only 8 U.S. presidents have died while not in office. The odds of 2 of them dying on the exact same day of the year, 1 in 182.5, assuming an even distribution, which, to be fair, it isn't. But even that doesn't account for the eerie thematic connection between them, both having served during periods of massive national instability, both treated as transitional figures, both overshadowed by the legacies of others. And then there's this. Johnson's presidency is often seen as an inverted mirror of Lincoln's, just as Taylor's is often seen as a precursor to the Civil War, which makes you wonder, are these shared dates just accidents? Or are we looking at some hidden architecture of fate, quietly ticking through American history? Coming up next, a different kind of calendar mystery. We're going to look at 2 presidents, 1 car manufacturer, and a death and a ride, both connected by the name, Ford. Because Lincoln wasn't just shot at Ford's Theater. The car Kennedy was killed in, it was a Lincoln, made by Ford, and it only gets weirder from there. Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln by Ford. Some coincidences make you pause. Others make you say, no way that's real. And then there's this one. You already know that Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in 1865, and you probably know that John F. Kennedy was shot in 1963 while riding in a Lincoln Continental. But here's what people often overlook. That car? It was made by Ford Motor Company. Let that sink in for a moment. Lincoln, shot in Ford's Theater. Kennedy, shot in a Lincoln, made by Ford. That's not a trivia trick. That's cold, documented fact. But it doesn't stop there. The parallels between Lincoln and Kennedy have become legendary. Some are just clever alignments. Others, they edge into something stranger. Let's line them up. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy was elected president in 1960. That's a 100-year gap on both counts. And both were succeeded by men named Johnson. Andrew Johnson, who took over after Lincoln, was born in 1808. Lyndon B. Johnson, who took over after Kennedy, was born in 1908. Again, 100 years apart. The assassins? John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln's killer, was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald, Kennedy's alleged killer, was born in 1939. Both assassins are known by 3 names, and both names contain 15 letters. Still with me? Both presidents were shot in the head on a Friday in the presence of their wives. Both were shot in public with massive national impact. And both murders were followed by deep investigations, public speculation, and a storm of conspiracy theories that still haven't settled. And here's one more. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. Kennedy had a secretary named Evelyn Lincoln. Now, to be totally fair, the Lincoln's secretary named Kennedy part is not well documented historically, but Evelyn Lincoln was absolutely real, and she warned Kennedy not to go to Dallas. She had a bad feeling. He didn't listen. What do we do with all this? Maybe it's pattern recognition. Maybe it's our brain playing connect the dots with history, but maybe, just maybe, there's a deeper current here. Presidents are supposed to represent the times they live in, but sometimes they seem to reflect each other, echoing forward and backward across decades like history is caught in a loop. And the Ford-Lincoln crossover, one shot in Ford's theater, the other in a Lincoln by Ford, feels like a cruel inside joke the universe slipped past the editors. Was it just coincidence? Or are there threads tying these assassinations together in ways we still don't fully see? Either way, it's one of the most chilling connections in presidential history, a riddle built from brands, bullets, and bizarre symmetry. Great catch. You're absolutely right. We already covered the story of Edwin Booth saving Robert Todd Lincoln back in segment 2, so we definitely don't want to repeat that. Let's keep the flow going by replacing segment 18 with a fresh but equally strange coincidence, one that builds on presidential patterns and uncanny historical overlap. The grandfather and grandson presidents, and the voter revolt that took them both down. There's only been one presidential duo in American history where a grandfather and grandson both held the office. Their names, William Henry Harrison and his grandson Benjamin Harrison. 2 men, 2 presidencies, a family legacy forged in war, and ended by strikingly similar political downfalls. Let's start with the elder. William Henry Harrison was elected in 1840, riding the wave of his military reputation from the Battle of Tippecanoe. His campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, is still quoted today. But his presidency lasted only 31 days. He delivered the longest inaugural address in history, refused to wear a coat in freezing rain, caught pneumonia, and died a month later, the first U.S. president to die in office, a promising start cut short by a storm. Flash forward 48 years. In 1888, his grandson Benjamin Harrison ran for president and won. But here's where the weird part starts. Benjamin Harrison lost the popular vote to Grover Cleveland, but he still won the presidency through the Electoral College, one of the rare times in U.S. history that's happened. It was controversial, people were angry, and by the time Harrison ran for re-election in 1892, the backlash was brutal. Who did he run against? Grover Cleveland. Again. And this time, Cleveland won, making him the only president in history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. Harrison was kicked out of office, just like his grandfather had been cut short by death. Both Harrisons entered the White House under public excitement. Both left under chaos and disappointment, and the eerie mirror continues. William Henry Harrison's entire political rise was tied to the Whig Party, which soon collapsed after his death. Benjamin Harrison's Republican Party was rocked by populist revolts, third-party challenges, and labor unrest during his term, weakening the GOP's grip for years. Even their personal lives followed strange parallels. Both Harrisons were known for being stoic and formal. Both relied heavily on advisors to shape their presidencies, and both saw their administrations haunted by economic and social instability, moments when the American people started questioning the system itself. There's a strange poetic thread here. Like the grandson was destined to relive the fate of his grandfather in political form, one struck down by illness, the other by popular revolt. One by the elements, the other by the will of the voters. And while Benjamin Harrison survived physically, he ended his presidency with almost the same level of national disappointment that surrounded his grandfather's tragic exit. It's the only time in history we've seen a direct bloodline repeat the arc of power and the fall. So what are the odds? 2 men, same family, same office, both brought in with promise, both sent out in disgrace or death. Both remembered less for what they accomplished, and more for how quickly it all unraveled. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the presidency doesn't just come with power. Maybe it comes with something else. Something that runs in the blood. Coming up next, a different kind of family twist. Not a bloodline, but a brotherly rivalry that changed the outcome of 2 major presidential campaigns, and possibly altered American history forever. The Kennedy brothers who tried to finish what JFK started, and met the same fate. The presidency is often seen as the peak of individual ambition, but in the Kennedy family, it was almost a family mission, passed from brother to brother like a torch, or a ticking time bomb. We all know what happened to John F. Kennedy, assassinated in 1963. Young, charismatic, idealistic, and gunned down just as his vision for a new frontier was gaining momentum. But the tragedy didn't end with him, because both of his brothers, Robert F. Kennedy and Ted Kennedy, would go on to chase the presidency, and both would be stopped in eerily parallel ways. Let's start with Robert, JFK's younger brother, Attorney General, and closest political confidant. After JFK's death, Robert was devastated. He withdrew from public life, but not for long. By 1968, amid the chaos of Vietnam, civil rights unrest, and political assassinations, RFK announced his candidacy for president. He wasn't just running, he was surging, winning primaries, connecting with voters, building a coalition of young people, minorities, and working-class Americans who saw him as the heir to JFK's legacy. Then on June 5th, 1968, just after winning the California primary, Robert Kennedy was shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He died the next day. Another Kennedy assassinated in public, at the height of political momentum. Another bright arc cut short. Now enter Ted Kennedy, the youngest of the Kennedy brothers. He never planned to run for president. But after the deaths of Jack and Bobby, it felt inevitable, like he had to. But fate had a different kind of bullet in store. In 1969, just a year after RFK's assassination, Ted Kennedy drove off a bridge in Chappaquiddick, Massachusetts. He survived. His passenger, Mary Jo Kopechne, did not. He didn't report the accident for hours, and when the truth came out, it destroyed his credibility overnight. He remained a powerful senator, and even flirted with presidential runs in the 1970s and 80s, but never recovered his national viability. So here's the pattern. JFK, assassinated in office. RFK, assassinated during his run for office. Ted Kennedy, politically killed, just as he was poised to inherit the role. 3 brothers, 3 presidential trajectories, 3 stops at the edge of ultimate power, all cut down one way or another. And here's where it gets even stranger. Each Kennedy ran during moments of deep national crisis. Cold War tension, civil rights clashes, Vietnam protests, Watergate distrust. Each one was seen not just as a candidate, but as a symbol of hope, progress, idealism. And each time the nation watched as that symbol was stripped away by violence, scandal, or silence. It's as if the closer the Kennedys got to the presidency, the more violently fate resisted. Could it all be coincidence? Maybe. But when you line them up, Jack, Bobby, and Ted, it starts to feel like a play written by a very cruel playwright, a family bound by legacy and doomed to repeat the same tragic arc. Lincoln's killer hid in a barn. So did the assassin of James Garfield. You'd think presidential assassins would want to disappear, melt into the shadows, vanish without a trace. But sometimes they just run into a barn. Yes, a barn. Here's the eerie part. Both of the first 2 successful presidential assassins, John Wilkes Booth, who killed Abraham Lincoln, and Charles Guiteau, who killed James Garfield, were found hiding or captured in or near barns after committing their crimes. Let's start with the more famous of the 2. On April 14th, 1865, Booth shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater, jumped to the stage, and fled Washington on horseback. A massive manhunt began. For 12 days, Booth crisscrossed southern Maryland and northern Virginia with a broken leg and a growing entourage of federal agents on his trail. Eventually, he and accomplice David Harold holed up in a tobacco barn on a Virginia farm owned by Richard Garrett. The barn was surrounded on April 26th, and Union soldiers ordered Booth to surrender. He refused, so they set the barn on fire. Inside the flames, Booth was shot, possibly by Sergeant Boston Corbett, though conspiracy theories persist. Either way, Booth died in a barn, surrounded by hay, fire, and the very people whose president he had just murdered. Fast forward to July 2nd, 1881. President James A. Garfield is shot in a D.C. train station by Charles Guiteau, a deranged and delusional office seeker. Garfield doesn't die immediately. He hangs on for 80 agonizing days, ultimately succumbing to infection and internal injury. Guiteau, unlike Booth, doesn't run far. He's arrested on the spot. But here's where things get weird. Some early reports, later echoed in trial transcripts and retellings, claim that Guiteau briefly escaped after the shooting, and hidden or near a barn on the edge of the city before being apprehended. The evidence is murkier than in Booth's case, but multiple early accounts confirm that Guiteau attempted to flee, wasn't immediately caught, and was hiding in a rural structure nearby before he was brought in. Even if we give this detail the benefit of the doubt, the symbolism is uncanny. 2 assassins, 2 political murders that shock the nation, and in both cases, a barn becomes the final scene. The bookend to violence, chaos, and national grief. It's almost cinematic. Barns, of course, symbolize rural simplicity. They're humble, honest structures, places for animals, not assassins. Yet here, they become death chambers, the opposite of the White House's grandeur, and the backdrop to presidential nightmares. Why barns? Maybe it was desperation. Maybe they just happened to be nearby. But the odds of 2 presidential assassins in 2 different decades being caught in almost identical hiding spots, that feels less like randomness and more like history echoing. And there's another layer to this. Both Booth and Guiteau were driven not just by ideology, but by delusion. Booth believed he was saving the Confederacy. Guiteau thought God had chosen him to bring down Garfield. Both men were dramatic, theatrical, and in a way seeking attention, not just death. And so maybe it's fitting that their last acts weren't in shadowy back alleys, but in open, combustible barns, places you can set on fire, surround, and point at. Places history remembers. Coming up next, we're staying in the realm of presidential entanglements, but shifting from bullets to bloodlines, because both Roosevelts shared a strange connection through one woman, Alice Hathaway Lee, and it's more twisted than you think. Both Roosevelts were related to Alice Hathaway Lee. Presidential coincidences often come wrapped in drama, tragedy, and eerie timing, but sometimes they come in the form of romantic entanglements and family trees that twist like a political soap opera. Let's talk about Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the mysterious thread that ties them both to one woman, Alice Hathaway Lee. Now, if you know anything about the Roosevelts, you know they were already distant cousins, 5th cousins to be exact, but their connection runs deeper than shared ancestry or similar career paths. It runs straight through Alice. Alice Hathaway Lee was Theodore Roosevelt's first wife. He met her when he was a student at Harvard. She was beautiful, charming, and from a well-connected Boston family. They married young, and by all accounts, Theodore was deeply in love with her, but tragedy came fast. In 1884, just 4 years after their wedding, Alice died suddenly of kidney failure, just hours after giving birth to their daughter, also named Alice. Here's where the heartbreak turns into a strange coincidence. On that same day, Valentine's Day no less, Theodore's mother also died in the same house. Staggered by the double loss, Roosevelt famously marked an X in his diary and wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." For years, he refused to speak about Alice at all. Her name was barely mentioned again, even in his autobiography. So, how does this connect to Franklin D. Roosevelt? Well, FDR married Eleanor Roosevelt, his 5th cousin once removed, and Theodore Roosevelt's niece. And guess who Theodore gave away at the wedding? That's right, the same man who had buried Alice Hathaway Lee stood as father of the bride at his niece's marriage to a future president. But it gets weirder, because FDR and Eleanor's family lines intertwine with Alice's through multiple branches. The Roosevelt family tree is full of intermarriage between distant cousins, and Alice Hathaway Lee was part of that broader social circle, the old money families of New York and Boston, who kept appearing in each other's lives, generation after generation. So both Roosevelts were tied to Alice, one as her husband, the other through family lineage and marriage into her extended circle. Both saw their political trajectories touched by the same network of influence, grief, and oddly repeating names. Even the name Alice continued to echo. Theodore's daughter, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, became a famous socialite, political commentator, and Washington power broker in her own right. She lived to be 96 years old, outlasting her famous father by over 60 years, and once said, "If you can't say something good about someone, sit right here by me." So we have 2 Roosevelts. One loses Alice in a devastating double death. The other marries into Alice's broader family line, while being handed into the spotlight by the very man she left behind. Coincidence? Maybe. But in the Roosevelt dynasty, names and legacies don't just pass down, they weave, and sometimes they tie themselves into knots that only history can untangle. Coming up next, a pro-slavery president who secretly bought enslaved people just so he could set them free. Yes, we're diving into the complicated and contradictory legacy of James Buchanan. James Buchanan bought slaves just to set them free. When you think of James Buchanan, you probably don't think of surprises. He's often remembered as the do-nothing president who watched the country crumble into civil war. His name usually ranks near the bottom of presidential lists, haunted by accusations of indecisiveness, political cowardice, and an almost eerie ability to do nothing at the worst possible time. But buried in the footnotes of his biography is one strange, unexpected twist. James Buchanan, a lifelong bachelor, a Pennsylvania Democrat, and a man who publicly supported states' rights to own slaves, once purchased enslaved people just to free them. Yes, really. Let's break this down. Buchanan was from Pennsylvania, a free state, and while he wasn't an abolitionist by any stretch, he personally claimed to oppose slavery on moral grounds. However, like many Democrats of his time, he also believed that the federal government shouldn't interfere with slavery where it already existed. Classic political hedging. But privately, it seems Buchanan's actions told a slightly different story. According to historians and letters from the era, while Buchanan was serving as a U.S. Senator and later as Secretary of State, he bought at least one enslaved person in Washington, D.C., a man named Stephen, through a middleman. Why? Not to work on a plantation, not to serve in his household, but to quietly emancipate him. The records suggest Buchanan knew that if he freed Stephen publicly, it could hurt him politically, especially among Southern allies. So he did it quietly, likely using a friend or aide to make the purchase, then arranged for Stephen to live as a free man, possibly in Pennsylvania. This wasn't a one-time thing either. Some sources claim Buchanan repeated this pattern, purchasing others in D.C. for the sole purpose of releasing them outside of the capital. He even funded travel for free black individuals to return to Liberia as part of the controversial colonization movement, a reflection of the era's mixed attitudes about black freedom. Now, does this make Buchanan a secret abolitionist hero? Not exactly. His presidency still catered to Southern interests. He backed the disastrous Dred Scott decision, insisted Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories, and did little to stop the secession crisis. In many ways, his personal morality never translated into public leadership, but this contradiction, a pro-slavery president quietly buying human beings just to liberate them, adds a layer of complexity to a man usually seen as flat and uninspiring. It forces us to ask, was Buchanan tormented by his conscience? Was he trying to reconcile his political ambition with private guilt? Or was he simply trying to look like a good man in a morally compromised world? Whatever his reasons, it remains one of the strangest paradoxes in presidential history. A president criticized for doing nothing, whose most compassionate act may have been one he hid from the public. Coming up next, we're shifting from contradiction to coincidence because it turns out JFK and Lyndon B. Johnson weren't just political allies. They were family in a strange, distant, genealogical kind of way. Yes, the two men who shared the Oval Office in the 1960s were also sixth cousins. Lyndon B. Johnson and JFK were sixth cousins. Politics can make people feel like family or enemies, but in this case, two of the most powerful figures of the 1960s were literally related, even if no one talked about it. John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, president and vice president, then successor and successor's successor, were sixth cousins, connected by a common ancestor in the tangled web of early American settlers. And while that might sound like distant trivia, when you look at how their lives and legacies intersected, it starts to feel eerily fitting. Let's start with the basics. Genealogists have confirmed that JFK and LBJ shared a common ancestor, Philip A. Abel, who lived in the 1600s. Through separate branches of the family tree, both men descended from his bloodline, making them sixth cousins, once removed. Now, sixth cousins is admittedly not that close. You probably wouldn't invite one to your wedding, but in a country of over 300 million, What are the odds that two presidents serving back to back during one of the most turbulent periods in American history would be related at all? It's even stranger when you look at how different they were on the surface. JFK, wealthy, charismatic, East Coast aristocrat, educated at Harvard, born into the Kennedy dynasty, a Catholic from Massachusetts with a Hollywood smile and a love of the spotlight. LBJ, gritty, blunt, Southern pragmatist, raised in poverty in rural Texas, a Protestant, a school teacher, a Senate brawler who climbed his way to power with political muscle and backroom deals. They couldn't have looked or sounded more different, and yet history paired them together, like opposite ends of the same presidential spectrum. And then came the twist. In 1960, JFK picked LBJ as his running mate. Despite fierce competition and personal tension, many believed Johnson was added to balance the ticket, to appeal to the South and help unite a fractured Democratic Party. But what neither man could have known was how short their partnership would be. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Lyndon Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One just hours later. The two men were related, and one inherited the other's job literally within the same day. Johnson would go on to pass some of the most ambitious civil rights legislation in U.S. history, much of it inspired by Kennedy's unfinished agenda. It's often said that LBJ completed the work JFK never got to finish. But now we know it wasn't just political succession. It was family business, in a way. And that raises a strange question. Did history pair these two for a reason? Or did fate simply fold the family tree in on itself, creating a brief moment where kinship and power overlapped under the weight of tragedy? Either way, the next time you think of Johnson taking the oath as Kennedy lay dead in Dallas, remember this: he wasn't just taking over as president, he was stepping in for a cousin. The first president to ride in a car was also the first killed after using one. Presidential history is full of firsts. The first to fly in an airplane, the first to appear on TV, the first to send a tweet. But William McKinley holds one of the strangest and darkest firsts of all. He was the first U.S. president to ride in an automobile, and shortly after embracing this new technology, he became the first president to be assassinated following a public ride in that same machine. Let's rewind to 1901. It's the dawn of the 20th century. The country is bursting with industrial growth, invention, and excitement about the future. Automobiles are still a novelty, loud, smelly, and confusing to most Americans, but they're also a symbol of progress, modernity, and power. President William McKinley, already in his second term, was a firm believer in innovation. He was curious, forward-looking, and wanted to be seen as a modern president for a modern nation. So when he attended the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, McKinley did something no other president had done before. He took a public automobile ride. It was a publicity moment. The leader of the free world rolling through the fairgrounds in a brand new electric car. Crowds gathered, people cheered. It was, in many ways, the perfect image of America entering a new century. But just days later, on September 6th, 1901, McKinley was shot twice by anarchist Leon Czolgosz while shaking hands with the public inside the exposition's Temple of Music. He died of gangrene 8 days later, and just like that, McKinley went from being a symbol of progress to a victim of openness, killed not on a battlefield, not in the White House, but at a public event where he had intentionally lowered the barriers between himself and the people. The irony: McKinley's embrace of modern transportation and public accessibility was part of what made him so beloved, but it was also what made him vulnerable. And it's not just that he was the first president to ride in a car and then was killed afterward. Here's where it gets creepier. He was succeeded by Theodore Roosevelt, who would go on to radically change presidential security, and who, interestingly enough, refused to ride in a car after McKinley's assassination, at least initially. The Secret Service, newly formalized after McKinley's death, began to tighten presidential protocols, controlling where presidents went, how they traveled, and, yes, when and how they appeared in public. So, in a way, McKinley's ride wasn't just symbolic. It was a turning point, the moment when the presidency stepped into the 20th century and paid the price for it. It's a sobering reminder that Being first often comes with unexpected consequences, and that progress, especially when you wear it in public, can make you a target. Today, presidential motorcades are armored, heavily guarded, and choreographed down to the second. But in 1901, one president simply took a ride and never truly came back. Coming up next, another strange wartime coincidence, this time involving two future presidents, two planes, and two brushes with death during World War II. Because George H.W. Bush and Gerald Ford didn't just survive war, they survived nearly fatal crashes on eerily parallel paths. George H.W. Bush and Gerald Ford both survived plane crashes in World War II. Before they were presidents, they were soldiers. Before the Oval Office, the press briefings, and the historic decisions, George H.W. Bush and Gerald R. Ford were just two young Americans caught in the deadliest war the world had ever seen. And both of them, decades before they'd ever dream of becoming president, narrowly escaped death in plane crashes during World War II. Let's start with George H.W. Bush. At just 18 years old, Bush enlisted in the U.S. Navy, becoming one of the youngest naval aviators in American history. By 20, he was flying combat missions in the Pacific Theater. No easy job, even for seasoned pilots. On September 2nd, 1944, Bush's plane was part of a bombing raid over Chichijima, a heavily fortified Japanese island. During the mission, Bush's aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire. The plane caught fire, but Bush kept flying long enough to complete his bombing run. Then, with smoke billowing and his aircraft dying, he told his two crewmen to bail out. Tragically, only Bush escaped. He parachuted into the ocean and floated in a life raft for hours, alone, injured, and surrounded by enemy forces, before being rescued by the crew of the USS Finback, a U.S. submarine that just happened to be nearby. He was the only survivor from his crew. Now let's jump to Gerald Ford, years earlier in the same war, serving in the U.S. Navy as well. Ford was assigned to the USS Monterey, a light aircraft carrier that saw combat throughout the Pacific. In 1944, that year again, the Monterey sailed directly into Typhoon Cobra, a brutal storm that battered the U.S. fleet. Waves reached 60 feet high, and ships were tossed like toys. 3 destroyers sank. Over 790 men were killed. During the storm, Ford was nearly swept off the deck by a massive wave. Only quick reflexes and a tight grip on a safety cable saved his life. Had he been a foot to the left, he'd have gone overboard and disappeared forever. Just another name on a casualty list. 2 future presidents, 2 life-threatening disasters at sea, 2 near misses that could have rewritten history. What if Bush hadn't been rescued in time? What if Ford had been washed away in the storm? No Bush presidency in 1988, no Ford stepping in after Nixon's resignation in 1974, no Gulf War, no Nixon pardon, no Bush family political dynasty, just silence. Empty chairs that history never fills. And it gets even stranger when you realize both men later became vice presidents before ascending to the presidency under unconventional circumstances. Ford after a scandal, Bush after Reagan's landslide. Both survived war. Both stepped into the highest office during moments of global tension, and both knew intimately that life could turn in a single moment. It's a strange reminder that sometimes the road to the presidency doesn't begin on a campaign stage. Sometimes it begins in the sky, spiraling toward disaster, and you only get there if you live long enough to tell the story. Coming up next, a presidential mystery not about war or scandal, but about names, because Harry S. Truman's middle name, it wasn't short for anything. Truman's middle name was just S. Presidential trivia can get weird, but this one might just be the most overlooked mystery in plain sight. What does the S in Harry S. Truman stand for? Here's the answer: nothing. That's right. It's not short for Samuel, Scott, Stephen, or any traditional middle name. The S in Harry S. Truman is just that, a single letter floating between his first and last name, with no word behind it. And somehow that became part of his legal identity as the 33rd President of the United States. So what's the story? Harry Truman was born in 1884 in Lamar, Missouri. His parents, John and Martha Truman, had a bit of a naming dilemma. Both sides of the family wanted to be honored in their son's name. On one side was Anderson Ship Truman, his paternal grandfather. On the other was Solomon Young, his maternal grandfather. Rather than pick just one and risk offending the other side, the Trumans went with a compromise. A middle initial S to represent both men, but standing for neither name specifically. That's the official explanation. A diplomatic solution for family balancing tradition and expectations. But the result was a man with a middle name that was technically just a letter. No period needed, no expansion possible. Just S, except even that got complicated. Throughout Truman's life, and even into his presidency, people kept adding the period. Harry S. Truman, assuming the S stood for something. Even official documents got it wrong. Historians, librarians, and archivists have debated for decades whether the period is grammatically correct. Truman himself wasn't much help. He was known to sign his name both with and without the period depending on the day. But when asked directly, he once said the period makes it look better. So even the man himself couldn't give a clear answer. And here's the strange part. Truman wasn't just some side figure in history. He was the man who authorized the use of atomic weapons, who navigated the end of World War II, who shaped the Cold War, desegregated the military, and led the nation through one of its most turbulent transitions. And yet, this tiny, almost comical detail about his name continues to baffle historians and grammar sticklers alike. It's not just trivia, it's symbolic. Because in a way, Truman's middle initial reflects who he was. A man stuck between two eras, two political worlds, two global orders, World War II and the Cold War. A president who didn't seek greatness, but was thrust into it. A man whose decisions didn't always fit neatly into expectations, just like his name. He came after FDR, one of the most towering figures in U.S. history. He had no college degree. He wasn't charismatic or flashy, but he was decisive, practical, and quietly shaped the world we live in today. So maybe it's fitting that the one thing nobody can agree on about Truman is whether his name even needs a period. The letter Nixon sent Trump in 1987. In politics, endorsements are everything. But what if one came decades before you ever ran for office, from a former president no less? In 1987, Richard Nixon, the 37th president of the United States, sent a letter to a man who, at the time, was just a New York businessman, known more for skyscrapers than speeches. That man, Donald J. Trump. And the letter's message? Nixon told Trump that if he ever entered politics, he believed he would be a winner. No, seriously, let's set the stage. At the time, Donald Trump was in his early 40s. He was rich, loud, and already famous in New York for his real estate empire, his extravagant lifestyle, and his growing presence in the media. His face was on magazine covers, and his name was beginning to appear in presidential speculation columns. As a kind of curiosity, a long-shot outsider, a novelty. But Pat Nixon, the former First Lady, had seen him on TV. She liked what she saw. After watching Trump appear on the Phil Donahue show in 1987, Pat Nixon was apparently impressed by Trump's confidence, charisma, and ability to work a crowd. She mentioned it to her husband. And shortly after, Richard Nixon sent a personal letter to Trump. It read, "Dear Donald, I did not see the program, but Mrs. Nixon told me that you were great on the Donahue show. As you can imagine, she is an expert on politics, and she predicts that whenever you decide to run for office, you will be a winner. With warm regards, sincerely, Richard Nixon." That's not a myth. The letter is real, and Trump himself has referenced it in interviews. So, what's so strange about this? Well, consider this. Nixon resigned in disgrace in 1974. Trump didn't run for president until 2015, nearly 30 years after that letter. He won in 2016, becoming the 45th president of the United States. A former president, once exiled from public life, saw something in a man who wouldn't become president until decades later, at a time when few took the idea seriously. That's not just a coincidence. That's a weird prophetic political time bomb waiting to go off. And it adds a strange layer to Trump's political image. Because Nixon, the master of the political comeback, the strategist, the deeply flawed genius of American politics, essentially handed Trump a kind of pre-campaign blessing. It's the only known example of a former president encouraging a future one while he was still just a businessman. And when you line up their careers, there are some bizarre parallels. Both were media obsessed. Both had deep distrust of the press. Both ran on a theme of law and order. Both faced impeachment inquiries. And both left office under a storm of controversy. So was Nixon right? Whether you like Trump or not, there's no denying he won. And he did it in a way Nixon might have appreciated. Defying the odds, outmaneuvering critics, and turning media chaos into momentum. All from a prediction made in a casual note, based on a talk show appearance. Coming up next, a presidential father who was born in 1790 and still had living grandchildren in the 2000s. Yes, we're talking about John Tyler, and time works very differently in his family. John Tyler still had living grandchildren in the 2000s. Here's a presidential fact that sounds completely made up. John Tyler, the 10th president of the United States, was born in 1790, and as of the early 2000s, he still had living grandchildren. Yes, grandchildren, not great-grandchildren. That means a man born during George Washington's presidency has grandkids who lived to see Barack Obama run for office. Let that settle in. Tyler became president in 1841 after William Henry Harrison died, just 31 days into his term. He was dubbed His Excellency and is often remembered as a controversial figure. He sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War and was even elected to the Confederate Congress, though he died before taking office. But despite his murky political legacy, it's his family tree that turned out to be one of the strangest presidential timelines in American history. Here's how it happened. John Tyler fathered 15 children, the most of any U.S. president, with 2 wives. His youngest son, Lyon Gardner Tyler, was born in 1853, when John Tyler was 63 years old. Now, Lyon, clearly not in a hurry, waited until his 70s to have children of his own. Enter Harrison Ruffin Tyler, born in 1928, and Lyon Gardner Tyler Jr., born in 1924. These 2 brothers were John Tyler's actual grandsons, not great-grandsons, grandsons. And yes, they were very much real. Harrison Tyler even gave interviews, maintained historical properties, and confirmed his lineage multiple times. He lived in Virginia and was actively involved in preserving his grandfather's home, Sherwood Forest Plantation. Lyon Jr. passed away in 2020, and as of that time, Harrison Tyler was still alive, making headlines as the grandson of a man born just a year after the Constitution was ratified. Let's put this in perspective. John Tyler was born before the invention of electricity, photography, and the typewriter. He lived through the War of 1812, the rise of the telegraph, and the westward expansion of the United States. He died in 1862, in the middle of the Civil War. Yet his grandson lived long enough to watch YouTube, use a smartphone, and Google his own family trivia. This isn't just a curiosity, it's a time-bending anomaly that bridges 3 entire centuries in just 3 generations. And it raises questions you never thought you'd ask. How do we define modern history when we're one handshake away from the 1700s? How can someone born before Abraham Lincoln still have living family who paid taxes in the internet age? It's not just weird, it's a reminder of how shockingly short American history really is. The country is barely 250 years old, and its early leaders are still echoing through the present, literally in the bloodline. Coming up next, a presidential brain flex that sounds like science fiction, because James Garfield could write Latin with one hand and Greek with the other at the same time. And no, it's not a myth. James Garfield could write in Latin with one hand and Greek with the other simultaneously, approximately 590 words. Presidents are known for speeches, laws, and the occasional scandal, not usually for blowing people's minds with parlor tricks. But James A. Garfield, the 20th president of the United States, had a talent that seems less presidential and more like something out of a science fiction novel. It's been widely reported and confirmed by people who knew him that Garfield could write in Latin with one hand and Greek with the other at the same time. Let that sink in. Not only was he fluent in both ancient languages, he could simultaneously write different sentences in each, with each hand, without pausing. This wasn't a party trick. It was a real skill. And it tells us a lot about who Garfield really was. Not just a politician, but a certified intellectual prodigy. Let's rewind to his early life. Garfield was born in 1831 in a log cabin in Ohio. He grew up poor, raised by a single mother after his father died when he was young, but he had one major advantage, a brain that never shut off. He worked as a janitor to pay for school, eventually attending Williams College, where he graduated near the top of his class. He was a teacher, a preacher, and even a university president before he turned 30. Garfield was fascinated by language, math, and logic. He once discovered a unique proof for the Pythagorean theorem. Yes, the triangle one, that's still taught in geometry classes today. And somewhere along the way, he developed his bizarre writing trick. Writing two languages at the same time with different hands isn't just impressive, it's neurologically extraordinary. It suggests Garfield had an unusual degree of hemispheric brain symmetry, meaning both sides of his brain could operate semi-independently with incredible coordination. It's the kind of thing you'd expect from a magician or a neuroscientist, not a future commander-in-chief. But that was Garfield. He was also ambidextrous, which helped. He reportedly used his left hand for Greek and his right hand for Latin, though some sources say he could switch it up depending on the day. Now here's the tragic part. Garfield was elected in 1880 and served just 200 days in office before he was assassinated by Charles Guiteau, a mentally unstable man who believed God had told him to kill the president. Garfield didn't die immediately. He lingered for months, suffering through painful treatments and botched medical care. When he finally died on September 19, 1881, the nation lost a president with extraordinary potential. Historians often say Garfield could have been one of the greats. He had intelligence, integrity, and a rare ability to connect ideas across disciplines. But fate had other plans. Still, it's fitting that one of the most intellectually gifted men ever to occupy the White House left behind a fact so strange, so impossible sounding, that people still double-check it to this day. And yes, it's real. Ulysses S. Grant was once arrested, while president, for speeding. We've had presidents accused of treason, bribery, and corruption, but only one U.S. president has ever been arrested while in office. And what was the crime? Speeding with a horse and buggy? Yes, this really happened. The year was 1872, and President Ulysses S. Grant was midway through his second term. The Civil War hero had already been hailed as one of the greatest generals in American history, but as president, he had a surprising personal habit. He loved to drive fast. And not just in a metaphorical sense. Grant enjoyed tearing through the streets of Washington, D.C. in his horse-drawn carriage. He owned some of the finest horses in the capital and was known for pushing them hard, too hard in fact for the local laws. At the time, D.C. had strict speed limits for horse-drawn carriages, around 6 miles per hour. Speeding was considered dangerous, especially with crowded streets and no real brakes beyond a skilled hand on the reins. Enter Officer William H. West, an African-American Civil War veteran who served on the D.C. police force. One morning, Officer West saw a carriage flying down the street. It was being driven recklessly, the horses galloping at full speed. He pulled it over, only to discover that the man behind the reins was President Ulysses S. Grant himself. Most officers would have backed off, but not West. According to West's own account, he warned the president about his behavior. Grant, to his credit, was respectful and promised to slow down. But the next day, he did it again. This time, West didn't let it slide. He arrested the sitting president of the United States. Now, don't picture handcuffs in a jail cell. Grant wasn't thrown behind bars. Instead, he was taken down to the local police station, booked, and fined $20. A decent sum at the time. What's remarkable is how calmly Grant handled it. He didn't argue. He didn't flash his title. He reportedly said something along the lines of, "I am very sorry, officer. I promise it will not happen again." And that was that. The president paid the fine and went on with his day, making him the only known president to be arrested while serving in office. It's a quirky, almost comedic story, but it says something deeper about Grant and about the times. Here was a former general who had commanded entire armies, a president who held the highest office in the land, humbly submitting to the rule of law over a speeding ticket. And here was a black officer, a former Union soldier himself, enforcing that law with integrity and courage, even when it meant confronting the most powerful man in the country. The story became part of DC lore, told and retold with varying details over the years. But Officer West's account remained consistent, and historians agree. It's one of the best documented minor infractions in presidential history. So next time you're worried about that parking ticket, just remember, one of our presidents got busted for reckless driving by horse. Coming up next, a Hollywood moment becomes a campaign identity. Because Ronald Reagan once played George Gipp in a movie, and the nickname the Gipper followed him all the way to the White House. Ronald Reagan once played the role of George Gipp and was later called the Gipper in office. Before he ever ran for governor, gave a campaign speech, or signed a bill, Ronald Reagan was just another actor in Hollywood. And it was a role he played in 1940 that would end up following him for the rest of his life. The movie? Knute Rockne, All-American. The role? A Notre Dame football legend named George Gipp. The result? A nickname that would help shape Reagan's presidential identity. Let's rewind. In the late 1930s, Reagan's film career was on the rise. He was known for his all-American charm and clean-cut presence. Not quite an A-lister, but definitely a rising star. When he landed the part of George Gipp in Knute Rockne, he had no idea it would become his most iconic role. In the movie Gipp, the University of Notre Dame's first real football hero falls ill and dies young, but not before giving his legendary coach, Knute Rockne, an emotional speech. Rock someday when the team is up against it, when things are wrong and the breaks are beating the boys. Tell them to go out there with all they've got and win just one for the Gipper. That line, win one for the Gipper, became an instant classic, and Reagan, forever linked to it, became known as the Gipper. Now here's where it gets weird. Fast forward 40 years. Reagan, now a former governor of California, is running for president. He's not exactly young. He's not the establishment choice, but he's got something no one else does, a story. Reporters asked about the Gipper. Crowds brought it up, and Reagan, never missing a beat, leaned into it hard. At rallies and debates, he would flash that signature smile and say, "I've been called a lot of things, but I always liked the Gipper." In 1988, while stumping for his vice president and successor, George H.W. Bush, Reagan stood before a crowd and said, "George, go out there and win one for the Gipper." It was a mic drop moment. A movie line turned into a campaign closer. And here's the thing. It worked. Reagan didn't just embrace the nickname. He built part of his political identity around it. It made him relatable, nostalgic, and larger than life all at once. He wasn't just a politician. He was America's coach, giving pep talks, making tough calls, and rallying the country in times of crisis. Even foreign leaders knew the nickname. Reporters used it in headlines. And to this day, the Gipper remains one of the most recognizable presidential monikers in modern history, second only to things like Honest Abe or Teddy. And let's not forget, it started with a fictionalized version of a real person. Reagan didn't invent George Gipp. He played him. But he absorbed the myth and then used it to tell a bigger story. One about optimism, grit, and winning even when the odds are stacked against you. So whether you loved Reagan or loathed him, you can't deny the magic of it. An actor playing a dying football star becomes president and turns a movie line into a national rallying cry. Coming up next, another double take involving famous names. Because before Monica Lewinsky, there was another Marilyn, and both Clinton and Kennedy had romantic ties to women with the same first name. Clinton and Kennedy both had mistresses named Marilyn. It's not unusual for U.S. presidents to be surrounded by rumors of romantic affairs, but in this case, two of the most famous names in presidential scandal history, John F. Kennedy and Bill Clinton, share an oddly specific coincidence. They both had mistresses named Marilyn. Let's start with the more legendary of the two. By now, it's practically American folklore that President John F. Kennedy had a relationship, or at the very least, a complicated friendship, with Marilyn Monroe. She was the ultimate Hollywood icon. He was the youngest, most glamorous president in modern history. Their rumored affair reached mythic status after Monroe's sultry performance of Happy Birthday, Mr. President at Madison Square Garden in 1962, just a few months before her death. She wore a skin-tight, flesh-colored dress and sang in a breathy whisper that still gets parodied today. Though JFK and Monroe were never publicly confirmed as lovers, insiders, biographers, and Secret Service staff have all suggested that the two did have a brief, highly secretive affair, one that ended abruptly, likely due to the risks involved. Now flash forward 3 decades. Bill Clinton, the 42nd president, also found himself entangled in a web of infidelity scandals. While his affair with Monica Lewinsky became the most infamous, it wasn't the first or the last name linked to him. One of the lesser-known women, Marilyn Jo Jenkins, a former Arkansas state employee. According to multiple reports and investigative books on Clinton's personal life, Jenkins and Clinton had an affair that predated his presidency while he was still governor of Arkansas. She was described as charming, discreet, and someone Clinton trusted enough to be seen with publicly on several occasions. The relationship wasn't as explosive or well known as the Lewinsky scandal, but it was significant enough that she was mentioned in Kenneth Starr's broader investigation and cited in several biographies of Clinton's political and personal life. So, here we have it. John F. Kennedy associated with Marilyn Monroe, the symbol of American sex appeal. Bill Clinton tied to Marilyn Jo Jenkins, a quieter but still consequential figure in his long trail of alleged affairs. Both relationships involved high-profile men who charmed the public but courted private scandal, deep concerns within their circles about leaks, blackmail, and media fallout, and of course, the name Marilyn. Coincidence? Probably. After all, Marilyn was a popular name in the 20th century, but still, the symbolism is too juicy to ignore. Both men are remembered as charismatic leaders with famously complicated personal lives. Both had intense relationships with the media, and both saw those relationships crash into scandal. And the name Marilyn serves as a bizarre through line. A callback to sex, secrecy, and power all wrapped in a 5-syllable scandal. It's the kind of connection that wouldn't raise eyebrows on its own, until you realize how much these two presidencies already had in common. Coming up next, a president who squeezed a full legacy into a single term, then died just 103 days after leaving office. We're talking about James K. Polk and how he worked himself to death trying to reshape America. James K. Polk accomplished nearly everything in one term, then died soon after. Most presidents spend their first term trying to make an impact. James K. Polk didn't wait. In just 4 years, he redrew the map of the United States, reshaped the presidency, and oversaw the largest territorial expansion since the Louisiana Purchase. Then, just 103 days after leaving office, he was dead. If that sounds intense, it's because Polk was intense. He didn't drink, he didn't socialize much, he had no interest in legacy tours or long retirements. He came to get things done, and he did, possibly to the detriment of his own life. Let's back up. Polk was elected in 1844 as something of a dark horse, a compromise candidate who promised to serve just one term and pursue 4 major goals: reestablish the independent treasury system, reduce tariffs, settle the Oregon Territory dispute with Britain, acquire California and New Mexico from Mexico. Most politicians promise a lot. Polk delivered on all 4 within his single term. He annexed Texas, triggering the Mexican-American War. He defeated Mexico and, through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, secured what is now California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. He settled the Oregon boundary dispute with Britain, securing the Pacific Northwest. He signed the Walker Tariff, significantly lowering rates, and he restored the independent treasury, separating government finances from private banks. It was a staggering run of achievement, almost unheard of for one term, but it came at a cost. Polk worked relentlessly. He micromanaged cabinet members, read every document, and insisted on overseeing even the smallest policy details. He rarely took vacations, often worked 12-plus hour days, and aged dramatically over his 4 years in office. When he left the presidency in March 1849, he looked years older, thin, pale, and exhausted. He and his wife Sarah took a brief trip to New Orleans, hoping to relax, but Polk contracted cholera, likely from contaminated drinking water, and died on June 15th, 1849, at the age of 53. He holds the record as the youngest president to die of natural causes. And here's the twist. Polk never lost an election in his life. He was a successful governor, Speaker of the House, and president, yet he's often overlooked today because he never sought re-election and died so quickly after leaving office. But make no mistake, his impact was huge. Polk's presidency set the stage for the American Civil War, whether he meant to or not. The new territories he added sparked fierce debates over the expansion of slavery, disrupting the fragile balance between North and South. In many ways, Polk expanded the nation's borders and opened its deepest wounds. Still, it's hard not to be struck by the eerie symmetry of his story. Elected unexpectedly, accomplished everything he set out to do, kept his promise to serve one term, died immediately afterward. It's almost like he was never meant to hang around, just to arrive, act, and vanish. Coming up next, one of the strangest moments in modern presidential history, when Jimmy Carter faced off with a swamp rabbit. Yes, really. President Jimmy Carter once fought a killer rabbit. Presidents are supposed to face off against world leaders, political enemies, and crises of state, not swamp rabbits. But in 1979, President Jimmy Carter made headlines for one of the strangest encounters ever recorded in presidential history, when he was allegedly attacked by a rabbit while fishing alone in Georgia. And yes, the White House confirmed it really happened. Let's rewind. It was April 20th, 1979. Carter was back home in Plains, Georgia, taking a much-needed break from the pressures of Washington. As an outdoorsman and a trained Navy man, Carter enjoyed the occasional solo fishing trip, so that morning he took a small boat out onto a pond near his home. That's when he saw it. A swamp rabbit, a large species of cottontail known for its strong swimming ability, was headed straight toward him, paddling through the water at surprising speed. Now, most people wouldn't panic at the sight of a rabbit, but this one wasn't hopping through the grass. It was charging across a pond, and Carter later said it looked panicked, like it was fleeing something, possibly hunting dogs. And when it reached Carter's boat, it tried to climb aboard. That's when things got weird. According to Carter, the rabbit made straight for the boat. Startled, he grabbed a paddle and splashed water at it, trying to drive it away. The rabbit eventually turned around and swam off, but not before giving Carter one of the most bizarre political anecdotes of the 20th century. At first, no one believed him. When he returned to the White House and told staff what happened, they laughed it off. A rabbit attack? In a boat? Was the president feeling okay? But then the photos surfaced. A White House photographer who'd been trailing the president from shore had snapped a picture of the exact moment. The image showed Carter in a canoe, paddle raised, and a rabbit clearly swimming in his direction. The photo wasn't released to the public at the time, but the press got wind of the story, and on August 30th, 1979, the Washington Post ran a headline that read, "Bunny goes bugs, rabbit attacks president." And with that, the killer rabbit incident entered presidential folklore. Late-night hosts, political cartoonists, and editorial writers had a field day. For a president already struggling with inflation, the energy crisis, and a perception of weakness, it was not a great look. Republicans pounced, using the story to portray Carter as ineffectual, a man literally fending off rabbits with a canoe paddle while the country spun out of control. But Carter, to his credit, took it in stride. He never denied it, and he didn't hide the photo when it eventually surfaced in the 1980s. Was it really an attack? Probably not. The rabbit was likely just frightened, and Carter happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that didn't stop the press from running wild with the story and turning it into one of the weirdest footnotes in presidential history. So yes, one time the President of the United States went fishing and ended up swatting a bunny with a paddle. Coming up next, a chilling political prophecy in cartoon form. Because in 1973, a drawing of Richard Nixon holding a sign that said, "I am not a crook," appeared in newspapers, months before he said it on live TV. Nixon's resignation was preceded by a prophetic political cartoon. Sometimes art imitates life, and sometimes it seems to predict it. In 1973, amid growing suspicion and mounting scandal, a political cartoonist published an image of President Richard Nixon holding a sign that read, "I am not a crook." There was just one problem. Nixon hadn't said those words yet. But weeks later, during a nationally televised press conference, Nixon would stand in front of America and deliver what would become the most infamous line of his presidency. I am not a crook. Coincidence? Creepy timing? Or a satirist who simply saw the train coming? Let's set the scene. It's the early 1970s. Nixon has just been reelected in one of the most lopsided victories in U.S. history, defeating George McGovern with 520 electoral votes. But behind the scenes, the walls are closing in. The Watergate break-in, initially dismissed as a minor campaign scandal, is beginning to unravel, and with it, the Nixon administration's carefully controlled image. Leaks, testimonies, and subpoenas start flooding the news. The press is in a feeding frenzy. Editorials sharpen their knives, and cartoonists, they go in for the kill. One cartoon, drawn in mid-1973, showed Nixon clutching a protest-style sign that said, "I am not a crook." At the time, it was meant to be a joke, an exaggeration of Nixon's slippery relationship with the truth, his obsession with loyalty, and the growing perception that he was covering something up. But then came November 17th, 1973. During a press conference at Walt Disney World of all places, Nixon was asked about his role in the Watergate scandal and the finances surrounding his personal income. Visibly agitated, Nixon replied, "I have never profited from public service. I have earned every cent, and in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I am not a crook." Boom. The phrase the cartoonist had mocked months earlier was now on record from Nixon's own mouth. And just like that, the satirical line became a defining quote, forever etched into the public's memory, headline after headline replaying it as a grim punchline to a collapsing presidency. It's one of the strangest moments where political satire met actual events head-on. The cartoon didn't just reflect Nixon's public image, it practically anticipated his words. And after that press conference, everything accelerated. Investigations intensified. The infamous White House tapes were exposed. The Saturday Night Massacre eroded public trust. And less than a year later, Nixon became the first and only U.S. president to resign from office. But it all started, in the public imagination at least, with a cartoon, a joke, a guess. That came true. It's a weird reminder that sometimes artists, critics, and comedians see the writing on the wall before the rest of us do, and that even presidents surrounded by power and secrecy can't escape the mirror that satire holds up to truth. FDR was related to 11 other presidents. In the history of U.S. presidents, no one had a family tree quite like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Sure, he was the 32nd president, the architect of the New Deal, and the only person ever elected to 4 terms. But behind the policies and the fireside chats was a lesser-known fact that makes his place in history even stranger. FDR was related, by blood or marriage, to at least 11 other U.S. presidents. That's not a typo. 11. He wasn't just the leader of the free world. He was practically the cousin of it. Let's break it down. Franklin D. Roosevelt was born into the old money elite of New York. His family belonged to the Dutch-descended Roosevelt dynasty, which split into 2 branches in the 18th century, one becoming Republican, Theodore Roosevelt's line, and the other Democratic, Franklin's line. FDR was a 5th cousin to Theodore Roosevelt, who also happened to be his wife's uncle. Yes, Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin's wife and the future First Lady, was Theodore's niece. So FDR married his distant cousin's niece and then later succeeded him in political legacy, if not name. Already complicated? We're just getting started. Here are just some of the presidents FDR was connected to by blood or marriage. George Washington, through marriage. John Adams, distant cousin. John Quincy Adams, through shared ancestry with the Adams family. James Madison, distant cousin. Martin Van Buren, distant relation through Dutch lineage. William Henry Harrison, by marriage. Benjamin Harrison, through the Harrison family line. Zachary Taylor, distant cousin. Ulysses S. Grant, by marriage. Theodore Roosevelt, 5th cousin as mentioned. William Howard Taft, distantly related through a series of colonial-era marriages. It's like FDR was playing presidential bingo and winning every time. Now, this doesn't mean they were all first cousins, or even close. Some connections were through shared great-great-great-grandparents, or collateral marriage lines that would make your family reunion map look like a conspiracy board. But even so, being related to a quarter of the presidents who came before you is no small thing, especially when you consider that most of them came from very different backgrounds, eras, and political parties. So what does it mean? Some historians argue it reflects the tight-knit nature of America's early elite. The political and economic power of early America was largely held by interconnected families, especially in the Northeast, where education, land, and legacy passed down generationally. Others say it simply shows how small the pool of early American leadership really was. When you dig deep enough, a lot of prominent colonial families connect, especially if your ancestors arrived in the 1600s and like to marry into similar circles. Still, FDR's case stands out. He didn't just follow in his cousin's footsteps, he surpassed them, becoming the face of American leadership during two of the biggest crises in U.S. history, the Great Depression and World War II. And maybe it helped that he had presidential DNA from all directions, a kind of living repository of American leadership, forged by bloodlines and battlefields alike. Coming up next, a funeral scene gone wildly wrong, when Andrew Jackson's pet parrot had to be removed for shouting obscenities during the service. Yes, the man was tough, but apparently so was the bird. Andrew Jackson's parrot had to be removed from his funeral for cursing. Presidents have had some strange pets. Thomas Jefferson kept grizzly bear cubs. Teddy Roosevelt had a one-legged rooster. Herbert Hoover had 2 alligators roaming the White House grounds. But Andrew Jackson's parrot, that bird got kicked out of his funeral for shouting curse words, and not just a few. According to witnesses, the language was so vile, so colorful, that they had to physically remove the parrot from the chapel. Yes, really. Let's break it down. Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, was a man known for his fiery temper, sharp tongue, and take-no-prisoners approach to politics. He fought in duels, he stared down Congress, and he once beat an attempted assassin with his cane. So it's no surprise his choice in pet reflected that same, let's say, intensity. Jackson's parrot, named Paul, was an African gray, one of the most intelligent and vocal parrot species in the world, known for their remarkable ability to mimic human speech. African grays are capable of learning hundreds of words, if not thousands, and Paul, apparently she had a taste for profanity. Jackson reportedly taught his parrot how to speak, and being the man he was, it's safe to say the bird's vocabulary included more than just hello. Over time, Paul picked up not only the usual phrases, but also some of Jackson's more colorful expressions, which according to staff and visitors were frequent and explosive. Fast forward to 1845, when Jackson died at the Hermitage, his Tennessee estate. Hundreds came to pay their respects: military men, politicians, family, friends, and local citizens. And there, among the mourners, sat Paul in a cage near the front. But as the funeral began, so did the problem. According to Reverend William Menifee Normant, who presided over the service, the parrot suddenly began squawking loudly, not just chirping or talking, but shouting full-blown curses, interrupting the solemn service with what the Reverend called profanity so shocking and unfit for a funeral that people were visibly disturbed. Eventually, Paul had to be removed from the chapel mid-service. Imagine the scene: mourners dressed in black, a coffin at the altar, and a parrot in the back yelling things that would make a sailor blush. It sounds like a comedy sketch, but it's a documented historical account. Norman's report appears in early Hermitage records and was later retold in numerous biographies of Jackson. Of course, some historians debate whether Paul really used that much foul language, or whether the story has been exaggerated over time. But the core fact that Jackson's parrot disrupted his funeral with inappropriate outbursts is widely accepted in presidential lore. And honestly, it feels just right. Andrew Jackson was one of the most controversial figures in U.S. history. He fought for the common man and against entire institutions. He redefined the presidency and left a legacy that still sparks debate today. So maybe it's fitting that, even in death, he couldn't quite go quietly, and neither could his bird. Coming up next, presidential health secrets, cover-ups, and a nation kept in the dark because Dwight D. Eisenhower had a heart attack while in office, and the public didn't find out until much later. Eisenhower had a heart attack in office, but hid it. In a world where every presidential cough gets scrutinized, it's hard to imagine a time when the leader of the free world could suffer a heart attack and keep it quiet. But that's exactly what happened to Dwight D. Eisenhower, the 34th President of the United States. Eisenhower, a five-star general, World War II hero, and beloved national figure, was a symbol of strength and calm during the tense early years of the Cold War. But in 1955, just 2 years into his presidency, that image almost came crashing down, along with his health. Let's walk through what happened. On the evening of September 23, 1955, Eisenhower was visiting Denver, Colorado, staying at his mother-in-law's home. After a round of golf, he was an avid golfer, he began experiencing chest pains, tightness, and nausea. Initially, his doctors thought it was indigestion, but by early the next morning it became clear Eisenhower was having a heart attack. He was rushed to Fitzsimons Army Hospital, and a team of military doctors quickly confirmed the diagnosis. He had suffered a serious myocardial infarction, a condition that could be fatal, especially in the 1950s. Here's where things get strange. The White House didn't immediately tell the public the full truth. The initial reports were vague, describing the president's condition as digestive distress. Only later, after leaks and mounting pressure, did officials confirm it was indeed a heart attack. For weeks, Eisenhower remained in the hospital. His cabinet took over many responsibilities, but no official power transfer occurred. There was no 25th Amendment yet. No clear protocol for what to do if the president was incapacitated. In fact, the crisis helped inspire the future drafting of the 25th Amendment, which wouldn't be ratified until 1967. During those weeks of uncertainty, the country held its breath. Would Eisenhower recover? Could he still lead? Should he seek re-election? His doctors eventually cleared him, with caution, and by early 1956, Eisenhower was back in Washington and preparing for a second term. He won re-election in a landslide. But here's the thing, that wasn't the end of his health issues. In 1956, he had intestinal surgery due to complications from Crohn's disease. In 1957, he suffered a mild stroke, and yet the public perception remained one of strength and stability, largely because the administration carefully controlled the narrative. Even today, some historians argue that the full scope of Eisenhower's health was downplayed for the sake of public confidence. After all, the US was in the middle of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was watching, and the idea of an ailing commander-in-chief could have triggered real panic, or worse, seen as an opportunity by America's enemies. So instead, the nation was told, Ike's doing fine, don't worry. And to his credit, Eisenhower did finish his second term and left office with high approval ratings. But his presidency marked a turning point, the moment when the public began asking, how much should we know about the president's health? And who decides when we, the people, deserve the truth? Coming up next, a bizarre and deeply ironic fact about Barack Obama's ancestry, because it turns out one of his ancestors owned slaves, a twist that complicates the story of America's first black president. Perfect. Here's segment 40, and it's a deeply ironic twist in the American story, one that adds complexity to a historic presidency. Obama's ancestors owned slaves. When Barack Obama became the 44th president of the United States in 2009, it was a historic milestone, the first black man elected to the highest office in a country built on the legacy of slavery. But buried in his family tree is a fact that seems to defy the very narrative his presidency symbolized. Some of Barack Obama's ancestors were slave owners. Yes, slave owners. And no, this isn't a bizarre conspiracy theory. This was confirmed by genealogical research conducted by organizations like Ancestry.com, PBS, and the New York Times, which all independently verified the same thing. Through his white mother's lineage, Obama is descended from American colonists who owned enslaved people. Let's break it down. Barack Obama's father, Barack Obama Sr., was from Kenya, but Obama's mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, was a white woman born in Kansas. Her family traces back to English settlers in colonial America, a group that includes a number of slaveholding ancestors. One of the most documented connections is to a man named George Washington Overall, a 19th century Kentucky resident who owned slaves. He was Obama's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather on his mother's side. Other slaveholding ancestors have been found in Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas as well, all tied to Obama's maternal roots. So, what do we do with that information? It's tempting to say it's just history, that many Americans with colonial ancestry likely descend from slaveholders simply because of how widespread slavery was in the South. And that's true. But it's also undeniably poetic and uncomfortable that the country's first black president, whose rise symbolized progress from America's racist past, is also a descendant through blood of those who upheld that past. In a way, Obama's ancestry reflects the country itself, a mix of contradictions, progress and pain, freedom and injustice, all woven into a single story. It also raises deeper questions. Can a nation ever really separate itself from its origins? Can any one person embody both the victim and the inheritor of a broken system? Obama himself has spoken openly about the complexity of his identity. In his memoir, Dreams from My Father, he reflects on the feeling of being a bridge between worlds, not just racially, but culturally, politically, and generationally. This strange coincidence, being the descendant of enslavers while becoming the symbol of racial advancement, only deepens that metaphor. And here's another twist. Obama is also distantly related to other presidents, including George W. Bush, Lyndon B. Johnson, Gerald Ford, and even Dick Cheney, all through distant colonial ties on his mother's side. So we're left with a portrait of a man who didn't just rise to power, he carried the entire arc of American history in his DNA. From enslavers to the enslaved, from old world bloodlines to modern hope, all converging in the story of one man and one presidency. Coming up next, a battlefield general who kept losing battles and still became the most celebrated military president in American history. Because George Washington, the father of the country, lost more battles than he won. George Washington lost more battles than he won. We call him the father of his country, the heroic general who led the American colonies to independence, and the first president who set the tone for all who came after. But here's the twist you may not expect, and George Washington lost more battles than he won. Yes, the man who defeated the mighty British Empire and became a national icon racked up a losing record on the battlefield, and yet, he still won the war. Let's dive into it. Washington's military career began long before the Revolutionary War. As a young officer in the French and Indian War, he saw early combat, but also early failure. His first major engagement, the Battle of Fort Necessity in 1754, ended with his surrender to the French, the only time he ever formally surrendered to an enemy. Fast forward to the Revolutionary War. In 1775, Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. It was an impossible job. Lead an underfunded, poorly trained, and loosely organized militia against the most powerful military in the world, Great Britain. And the early results? Not great. Let's tally just a few of Washington's notable losses. The Battle of Long Island, 1776. A devastating defeat where the British outflanked and nearly crushed the Continental Army. Washington's forces narrowly escaped under cover of fog and darkness. The Battle of White Plains, 1776. Another British victory that forced Washington to retreat again. The Battle of Brandywine, 1777. The British captured Philadelphia after outmaneuvering Washington's forces. The Battle of Germantown, 1777. A well-intentioned plan that ended in confusion and retreat. By most conventional standards, Washington was not a brilliant battlefield tactician. He lacked the refined military training of his European counterparts and often found himself outmaneuvered. But here's what made Washington exceptional. He never gave up. Where other generals sought decisive victories, Washington understood that the key to winning the war wasn't seizing cities. It was survival. His true genius was strategic, keeping the Continental Army alive, mobile, and committed to the cause, no matter how many battles they lost. He knew that, as long as the army existed, the revolution could not be declared dead. And of course, there were victories too, often when it mattered most. Trenton, 1776. After crossing the Delaware River, Washington's surprise attack on the Hessians was a huge morale booster and a tactical triumph. Princeton, 1,777. Another unexpected success, which restored confidence in the Continental Army after a long string of defeats. Yorktown, 1,781. The final and most important win, where Washington, with help from the French, forced the surrender of British General Cornwallis, effectively ending the war. So yes, Washington lost more battles than he won, but he won the war by refusing to be defeated and by mastering the long game. It's a reminder that leadership isn't about perfection. It's about perseverance. And sometimes the man who stumbles the most ends up carrying the greatest legacy. JFK Jr. died on the 30th anniversary of Chappaquiddick. When people talk about the Kennedy curse, it's not just about accidents, assassinations, or lost elections. It's about timing. It's about moments that feel too perfectly tragic to be accidental. One of the eeriest examples, John F. Kennedy Jr., the only son of President John F. Kennedy, died in a plane crash on July the 16th, 1999, exactly 30 years to the day after his uncle Ted Kennedy drove off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island, resulting in the death of Mary Jo Kopechne and the permanent stain on his political future. Let's unpack this bizarre alignment. Chappaquiddick, 1969. Senator Edward Ted Kennedy, the youngest brother of JFK and Robert F. Kennedy, was seen as the last great hope for a future Kennedy presidency. But on the night of July 18th, he drove his car off a narrow bridge on Chappaquiddick Island, Massachusetts, with Kopechne, a young campaign staffer, in the passenger seat. Kennedy survived. Mary Jo did not. What followed was a national scandal. Kennedy waited hours before reporting the accident, and questions swirled about whether Kopechne could have been saved had he acted sooner. Ted eventually pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident, received a suspended sentence, and, though he remained in the Senate, his presidential ambitions were effectively over. That event, the Chappaquiddick incident, became one of the darkest chapters in the Kennedy story. Now flash forward exactly 30 years, July the 16th, 1999. John F. Kennedy Jr., often referred to as America's Prince, was piloting a small plane from New Jersey to Massachusetts, along with his wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister, Lauren Bessette. They were flying to attend the wedding of his cousin, Rory Kennedy. Somewhere off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, the plane disappeared from radar. A massive search ensued, and days later, wreckage was found. All 3 passengers had died in the crash. Investigators concluded that JFK Jr. likely became disoriented in poor visibility, a common hazard for amateur pilots flying over water at night. The country was stunned. Yet another young, promising Kennedy, gone far too soon. And the symbolism didn't go unnoticed. Same family, same state, same date. July 16th. Exactly 30 years apart, 2 events that deeply altered the course of the Kennedy legacy. One political, one personal, both ending in water, both shrouded in loss. It was almost as if the family was being pulled back into the same moment in time, like a scar that reopens on its anniversary. JFK Jr.'s death marked the end of an era. He had never held elected office, but he carried the weight of his father's legacy. With charm, grace, and media magnetism, many believed he would someday run for office. But like so many Kennedys before him, his story ended before it could really begin. And the fact that it ended on the anniversary of the event that destroyed his uncle's shot at the presidency, that's more than coincidence. It's myth. It's tragedy with a calendar. Coming up next, the numbers behind 2 modern presidents that seem just a little too aligned. Because Trump and Biden were born 878 days apart, both from Scranton-connected families, and ended up facing off at nearly the same age. 3. Trump and Biden were born 878 days apart, both in Scranton-adjacent families. In politics, timing is everything, and sometimes the numbers tell a stranger story than the headlines ever could. Consider this. Donald Trump and Joe Biden, the 2 men who faced off in the 2020 U.S. presidential election, were born exactly 878 days apart. That's a gap of just under 2.5 years. And despite their fierce rivalry, contrasting styles, and radically different public images, they share oddly similar origin points, both personally and geographically. Let's dig into the numbers first. Donald Trump was born on June 14th, 1946. Joe Biden was born on November 20th, 1942. If you plug those dates into a time calculator, you'll find they were born exactly 878 days apart, or 2 years, 4 months, and 6 days. Why does that matter? Well, for starters, it made them the oldest pair of major party nominees in American history. In the 2020 election, Biden was 77 and Trump was 74. Regardless of party, they represented the most senior matchup the U.S. has ever seen. But the symmetry gets weirder when you look at where they came from. Joe Biden was famously born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, before moving to Delaware as a child. Scranton has long played a symbolic role in Biden's identity, the working-class hometown, the place of modest beginnings. But what's often overlooked is that Trump's family has Scranton ties too. While Donald Trump himself was born and raised in Queens, New York, his mother, Mary Ann McLeod Trump, came from a modest background in Scotland, and his father, Fred Trump, had family ties to Pennsylvania, including the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton region. Trump's paternal ancestors lived and worked in the Scranton area before settling permanently in New York. So both men, though vastly different in personality and privilege, had roots that touched the same Rust Belt region. And then, decades later, they found themselves running against each other, vying for the presidency during one of the most divided and tense moments in modern American history. Even their political arcs have strange parallels. Both were lifelong politicians in different ways. Biden in public service, Trump in media and business. Both have faced impeachments. Trump during his presidency, Biden with rumblings and inquirers in the aftermath of his election. Both have sons who have been at the center of controversy, and both have positioned themselves as the defender of the real America, though with drastically opposing visions of what that means. It's like watching two different versions of the American dream collide, just 878 days apart. Even the 2020 election was riddled with bizarre timing overlaps. The pandemic, the protests, the mail-in ballots, all playing out in a world where these two men, born just over 2 years apart in the 1940s, were fighting for control of a 21st century superpower. And in 2024, if they meet again, both pushing past their 80s, the symmetry will only deepen. Is it fate? Coincidence? Or just a reminder that in American politics, the past is always colliding with the present? 4. Jimmy Carter once filed a UFO report. Long before he was president, Jimmy Carter looked up at the night sky and saw something he couldn't explain. Not a shooting star, not a satellite, something truly unidentified. And unlike most people who might shrug off a strange sighting, Carter, ever the detail-oriented man, did something few future world leaders have done. He filed an official UFO report. Let's set the stage. It was 1969, and Carter was still a Georgia state senator, years away from national politics. He was preparing to give a speech at a local Lions Club meeting in Leary, Georgia, when he and a group of about 10 people witnessed something strange just after sunset. According to Carter's own written report, filed in 1973 with the International UFO Bureau in Oklahoma City, the object appeared above the horizon in the western sky. He described it as a very bright light, changing colors from white to blue to red, and then back again. It didn't make a sound. It hovered silently, then moved away at a high speed. Carter estimated it was visible for about 10 minutes. His conclusion? He didn't know what it was, but he didn't think it was alien either. Still, the sighting left an impression. And Carter, a trained nuclear physicist and deeply curious man, wasn't the type to let things slide without documentation. So 4 years later, he submitted an official report, complete with time, location, number of witnesses, and a full description of the event. He would later tell reporters, "It was the darndest thing I've ever seen. It was big. It was very bright. It changed colors, and it was about the size of the moon." Now here's where it gets weirder. When Carter ran for president in 1976, he was frequently asked about the sighting, and at one point, he even promised that, if elected, he would make all U.S. government information about UFOs public, unless it posed a threat to national security. Naturally, this excited UFO enthusiasts everywhere. A future president who had seen a UFO and wanted to declassify the files? Unheard of. But after taking office, Carter backed off. He reportedly met resistance from the CIA and other agencies, who warned him that releasing certain files, especially those connected to defense surveillance programs, could compromise national security, so Carter never followed through on the full disclosure. He remained relatively quiet about the topic throughout his presidency. Still, his 1969 sighting and 1973 report remained part of the official UFO record, and he's often cited in discussions about presidents and the paranormal. Was it an alien spacecraft? Probably not. Most researchers believe Carter likely saw a high-altitude aircraft, or perhaps the planet Venus, which is frequently misidentified due to its brightness. But Carter himself never retracted the report. He simply acknowledged the limits of human understanding and the need to take the unknown seriously. It's one of the rare moments in presidential history where a future commander-in-chief openly admitted, "I don't know what that was." And for a man who would go on to oversee nuclear treaties, global diplomacy, and humanitarian missions, that kind of honesty stands out. Coming up next, a constitutional crisis that gave America two presidents at once. Kind of, because in 1876, the election was so contested, we ended up with dueling inaugurations and a political standoff that nearly broke the country. The U.S. had two presidents at the same time, sort of. It sounds impossible. The United States can't have two presidents at once, right? Well, in 1877, it very nearly did. The election of 1876 was one of the most chaotic, disputed, and dangerous in American history. So much so that for a brief moment, the country didn't know who the president actually was. And for several weeks, it looked like both men were preparing to be sworn in, setting the stage for what could have been a constitutional civil war. Here's what happened. The election was between Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, and Samuel J. Tilden, a Democrat. Tilden was a popular reformer and had already served as governor of New York. Hayes was a lesser-known candidate from Ohio with strong support from the North. When the votes were counted, Tilden had won the popular vote and seemed to have more electoral votes as well. He needed 185 to win and had 184 confirmed. Hayes had 165, but 20 electoral votes from 4 states, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon, were disputed. Both parties accused each other of fraud. Both sent competing slates of electors, and both claimed victory. It was a national nightmare. For months, Congress couldn't agree on who had legitimately won. Tensions were so high that rumors of a second civil war began to circulate. Armed militias began to form. Both Hayes and Tilden refused to concede. To avoid total disaster, Congress created a special electoral commission in early 1877, made up of 5 senators, 5 House members, and 5 Supreme Court justices. Their job? Decide who really won. After weeks of debate, the commission, by a vote of 8 to 7, straight down party lines, awarded all 20 disputed electoral votes to Hayes. That gave him 185 votes, just enough to win by a single vote. But here's the kicker. The decision came just 2 days before Inauguration Day. Democrats were furious. Many refused to accept the outcome and threatened to block Hayes from taking office. The standoff became so intense that both Hayes and Tilden began preparing for their own inaugurations in different places. There was even talk of 2 rival governments, 2 presidents, and 2 executive branches claiming legitimacy. In the end, the conflict was resolved in a backroom deal known as the Compromise of 1877. Democrats agreed to accept Hayes as president. In return, Republicans promised to end Reconstruction, withdraw federal troops from the South, and essentially hand control back to former Confederate states. Hayes was quietly sworn in private on March 3rd to avoid any chance of disruption. He was sworn in publicly the next day, March 4th, 1877, but the nation remained deeply divided. So no, the U.S. didn't officially have 2 presidents at the same time. But for a tense, pivotal moment, it came within inches of it. It's a reminder that democracy is fragile and that even the oldest, most stable systems can be pushed to the brink by ambition, distrust, and a refusal to concede. And yet, the country held. Just barely.